Chapter 9 of The Ghost Camp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ghost Camp by Rolf BOLDREWOOD. Chapter 9. Chapter 9. "I'd like to tell you, sir," said Carter, "how we first got acquainted, me and Mr. Blount, to put him right with you, because I heard a whisper that you thought he must be in with us, in the cross-butchering line." "I don't deny," I answered, "that I thought it very suspicious that a man like him should be living with you fellows, and yet have no idea that dishonest work was going on. All right, Mr. Bruce, don't spare us. It was dishonest. There's no two ways about it, and we chaps ought to be ashamed of ourselves, as we are able to get a living straight and square, and under no fear of man. Now we've had a fright and been let off. You'll never hear another word against us. But I wanted to have a word about Mr. Blount. If he had been copped along with us, it would have been a cruel shame, a regular murder, and him as innocent as the child unborn. His horse was knocked up, or next door to it, when I came across him a few miles from the Lady Julia. I'd a few cattle with me, and asked him to help me drive them. He stayed at our place that night. The man I was selling them to sent for them before daylight, and all he could hear was them being let out of the yard. He was a dividing mate after that, though," I said, knowing that such mining agreements comprehend all knowledge in heaven and earth and under the sea. Carter answered my unspoken thought when he said, "He bought Tumbarumba Dick's share with him as he went to Coolgardie, and if he knew mullock from wash dirt, then it's as much as he did. As for cattle, he hardly knew a cow from a steer. Then he lost his moke and went down the river to get word of him." "Yes," I said, "I met him then. He came on me just as I was shooting a small mob of wild horses. I had been watching them for some months. They seldom came so far in, but I dropped the stallion first shot, a noted grey, said to be a thoroughbred. The mares and foals wouldn't leave him, so I got them all, one by one." Mr. Blount was astonished, I suppose. "Seems a pity, too. They were a well-bred lot. I've had many a gallop after the same lot, thinking to yard 'em, but they always got away. Anyhow, they're no blessed good. If you do yard 'em, mostly sulk and always clear the first chance. His cob, it seems, joined your horses, and was run into the paddock. So you put him up for the night and sent him home on his own horse. Came part of the way with him, you and the laddies, and Black Paddy. Nigh hand to the Lady Julia, you spotted your E.H.B. bullock with the fresh brand on, and he never said nothing. Next day, Black Paddy ran our tracks to the claim and the stockyard. Found where the last bullocks had been driven to the Black Creek slaughter yards. That was as plain as ABC, and we had to clear. Phelim waited on to get his horse back that he'd lent him, and started after Pat and Linky, who were well on their way to Omeo." "All quite correct," I said, "but why didn't he act straightforwardly and tell me like a man that he had been working in your claim?" "Because he didn't want to give us away, and if he said what he knew but didn't understand, the police would have been up the next day and collared the lot of us before we had a chance to cut it." "But why was he so tender about your party?" I said. "You had deceived him, and he might naturally have felt angry at being let in for aiding and abetting cattle stealers, and all the more anxious to see you punished." "That's all right, Mr. Bruce. But you see, there was another reason why he stood by us, though he didn't wait an hour after he knew we were on the cross. Wouldn't take his share of the gold neither, which he'd worked for as hard as any of us." "What was the other reason?" "Well, sir," rather shamefacedly, "he thought I'd saved his life, as it were." "Saved his life? How could that be?" "It was this way, sir." As he spoke, he looked quite sad and confused. "You know that razor-back ridge on the short track to Bunjil?" "Yeah, I was over it once, and a brute of a track it was. That was where Paddy Farrell was killed." "The same." "Well, when we was coming along from Bunjil to the claim, that cob of his, a flat country horse, got frightened, and had half a mind to go back over the edge. I was thinking of something else. When I looked back, I saw Mr. Blount was confused like. He didn't know how to stop him. I slipped off and held the cob, while he did the same, and started old Kiwa along the track, with his reins tied to the stirrup iron. My old moke trotted on, and the cob after him, till they came to the trap yard, where we found them when we came up half an hour later. There wasn't much in it. Any man who'd lived in rangy country couldn't have helped doing it, but he chose to believe I'd saved his life. So it was chiefly that made him not let on to you about where he'd lived. Nothing might have come of it, but it was a close shave, and no mistake. I'm very glad to hear the explanation, Carter. I don't see how he could have acted differently as a man or a gentleman. I shall write and tell him so. And now a word with you, which you can pass on to your mates. Make no mistake, you've got a fresh start in life. You 3 fellows are young. Anything there is against you, as far as I know, is over and done with. These warrants are just waste paper. But be careful for the future. If you stick to the Nundaroo station till the drought's over, you're made men. I'll let the Inspector General of Police know how you behaved. All right, sir, we're on. We won't go back on you, was his reply. You may expect to see me at Miranda within the month, though traveling through a desert, as this country virtually is now, is very slow and unsatisfactory. I must pick up a riding camel, a heirie, such as I've seen in the East, warranted to keep going for 24 hours on end, without water or food. However, I suppose rain will come some time or other. Thus fully exonerated, it may be believed that Blount made the best use of his time at Miranda, where he had the field all to himself, with the advantage of the most considerate chaperones, in the person of Mrs. Bruce, who had always been, as she told him, his staunch supporter, even in the dark days, when her husband forbade his name to be mentioned, and when from adverse circumstances no letters had arrived to clear his character. I never doubted you for a moment, murmured Imogen, but it must be confessed, it was hard work holding to my trust in you, when so many rumours were flying through the country. I never could make out why you joined such people at all, or what you were to gain by it. If you wish to know what a miner's life was like, there are plenty of gentlemen glad enough to go into any venture of the sort, with the aid of a little capital. Men such as you have described at the Comstock or Zeehan. But how was I to find them? Just the same way in which you would have done in England, through introductions to men of mark out here. They would have advised you for your good, and there would have been no risk of your being compromised by any action of theirs. No doubt it was indiscreet of me, but I wanted to see for myself and form my own opinion by personal experience of a society so different from any I had known before. That is where you conceited Englishmen, here she held up a warning finger, make a mistake. Indeed, tons of mistakes. In vain we tell you that there is no special difference here between the classes of society, or the laws which rule them, and of those of your own beloved country, and those of your own beloved country, which we are proud to resemble. But are they not different? Not radically by any means. Any departure from English manners and customs is chiefly superficial. Your squire, or lord of the manor, says, "Mornin', Jones, crops doin' so-so, too dry for the roots," and so on. "Nice 4-year-old of yours, looks as if he'd grow into a hunter." But there's no real equality, nor can there be. Jones doesn't expect it. Mr. Bruce, I suppose, has much the same feeling for the farmers here, and they meet on much the same terms, except when the suspicion of duffing comes in, eh? Then relations are strained indeed, as between the same classes, if poaching was discovered and brought home to the guilty ones. They had these, with many other talks and disquisitions, such as are interesting to lovers, and lovers only, in the long delicious evenings and unquestioned idleness, which are the prerogatives of the halcyon days which follow a declared engagement, and before the completed drama of marriage. The soft, mild months of the southern spring were now heralding the less romantic season of the Australian summer. The sun god was daily strengthening his power, with as yet the fierce noonday glare or burning heat. Chiefly precious to them were the moonlight walks by the riverside, when the shadows of the great willows which fringed the river bank fell over the hurrying tide, when star sheen or moon rays glinted through the close foliage, or sparkled diamond bright in the rippling bars. There was a winding path, a few feet from the bank, accurately marked by the cattle and horses, which roved unchecked through the great meadows. Here the lovers were at liberty to indulge in fullest confidences. He told her that he had loved her from the very first moment his eyes fell upon her, when, not knowing that any other than Mrs. Bruce was in the house, he had been almost unconventional in the surprise of the meeting and his instant admiration. "That moment sealed our destiny," he said, "or rather would have left me a lifelong regret had I never set eyes on you again. And what was your feeling, Imogen?" Looking suddenly into her eyes, which, lit up by a fairy moon-ray, seemed to his eager gaze to glow with unearthly radiance. So in the old days did the fabled Oread enthrall the heart of the doomed shepherd or woodsman, luring him to follow into her enchanted bower, which he was fated never again to discover, wasting life, wandering through the forest aisles, wearing out health, youth, and passion, in the ever-fleeting, illusory pursuit. "I think," she answered softly, as her eyes fell before his ardent gaze, "that I must have been similarly affected. Why, I cannot tell. But the fact remains that if you had never returned, and we had not much time for love-making, had we, between that day and your return to the Lady Julia claim, and the fascinating society of Mr. Little Riverjack, I should have fallen into a sadness, and then into a fast, thence into a weakness, and so on. As it was, I was very melancholy and low for a while, and between that and the influenza, very nearly went out, as my maid Josephine McIntyre phrased it. Then, when I was coming round and reaching the stage of the common air, the sea, the skies, to her our opening paradise, and would have written to you, we heard that you had become a millionaire or a silver king in Tasmania. It was foolish, I know, but I thought it might look as if I wanted to recall you because of your wealth. A vulgar idea, but still one that works for good or evil in this silly life of ours. But now all will be forgiven, if this should meet the eye, etc., as the advertisements say. You will forgive me, and I will forgive you, and there will never be any more doubts or despair. Will there?" That Mr. Blount made a short but impressive reply to this query may be taken for granted. The river marge, the sighing, the trailing willows, the rippling, murmuring stream, the friendly moon, all these were conditions eminently favorable to love's young dream. Nor did they fail in this instance to ratify the solemn, irrevocable vow, often lightly, rashly, falsely sworn, but in this instance repeated with all the passion of ardent manhood, responded to with the heart's best and truest affection, the sacred, intensely glowing flame of the maiden's love, imperishable, immortal. "You told me, the last time we met," she whispered, "that some day I should know why you came here to lead aimless, wandering life. I always thought there was some mystery about it. Will you tell me now? It's lovely and mild. There could not be a better time. How clearly you hear the ripple in the shallows. Was there a woman in it?" "Of course there was, but mind, it all happened 7 years ago, so if what I say may be used against me on my trial, I shall be dumb." "I've copied out dispositions now and then for Edward," replied the girl archly. "Having heard the evidence, do you wish to say anything comes next. So I'll promise not to take advantage of your voluntary confession, if you make a clean breast of it for once for all. I have no fear of the dear dead women, whoever they were." "You need not," said Blount, as he drew her more closely to him, not if Helen of Troy were the company. On their return to the veranda, they found Miss Bruce still occupied with the needlework, which took up, so she said, fortunately, so much of her time. Imogen pleaded fatigue and retired, leaving the field free to her sister and the guest. Thereupon commenced a long and apparently serious conversation. Mr. Blount spoke more unreservedly of his private affairs than he had hitherto thought it expedient to do. Independently of his share in the great Comstock Company, for which he had already been offered £100,000, he had a handsome allowance from his father, as also, thinking it might be needed, a letter of credit upon the Imperial Bank for £5,000. "It will always be a puzzle to me and Imogen," said Mrs. Bruce, "how, with all that money at your disposal, you should ever have run the risks you did in this gypsy business with the people we found you with, or would have done if you had remained a few days longer with them. You didn't want to learn their language, like Borrow. What other reason could there be?" "My dear Mrs. Bruce," he replied, "you have been so good, considerate, and friendly to me, that I must make a clean breast of it. I have already told Imogen all there is to tell of a by no means uncommon event in a man's life, when one of your adorable yet fatal sex is mixed up in it." "I see. I understand the eternal feminine. We have not many romances of the kind in these quiet hills, but of course they are not wholly unknown, even in our sequestered lives. You are going to tell me of your tragedy." It was not far removed from the ordinary run of such adventures, though there might easily have been a catastrophe. I was young. I said it was 7 years ago, since which I have industriously wasted life's best gifts in trying to forget her. Beautiful? Yes, as a dream maiden, a recognized queen of society, flattered, worshipped, wherever her fairy footsteps trod, but vain, ambitious, and false as the Lorelei or the mermaiden that lures the fated victim. More than one man had thrown life, character, or fortune at her feet, unavailingly. I had heard this, but with the reckless confidence of youth I heeded not. I met her at the quiet country house of a relative. Men being scarce, she condescended to play for so poor a stake as the heart of a younger son, an undistinguished lover's existence. And she won. How could it be otherwise? She turned the full battery of her charms upon the undefended fort. We rode together. We fished the trout stream, more dangerous still. We read in the old library morning after morning, and here my not unmarked university career served me well, as I thought. I had been reading aloud from a novel of the hour, when looking up, suddenly I saw the light in her eyes, which gave me hope. More than hope. I took her hand. I poured out protestations, entreaties, vows of eternal love. Whatever man has distilled from inward fires of soul and sense under the alembic of love with white heat, I found words for and poured into her not unwilling ear. She was visibly agitated. Her cold nature, serenely lovely as she always was, seemed to kindle into flame under the fire of my impetuous avowal. I gained her other hand. I threw myself on my knees before her, and drew her down to the level of my face. I clasped her yielding form, and kissed her lips with soul-consuming ardor. To my surprise, she made no resistance. Her color came and went. She might have been the veriest country milkmaid, surprised into consent by her rustic lover's eagerness. "You are mine. Say you are mine forever," I whispered into her shell-like ear as her loosened hair fell over her cheek. "Yours," she said in a low, intense murmur, "now and forever." Then, gently disengaging herself from my arms, "This is a foolish business. I confess to being rather unprepared, but I suppose we must consider it binding?" "Binding," I said, shocked at the alteration of her tone and manner. "To the end of the world, and afterwards, in life and death, my heart is yours unalterably, to wear in true love's circlet, or to break and cast beneath your feet." "Poor Val," she said, smoothing my hair with her dainty jewelled fingers. "Yet women have played false before now to their promises, as fondly made, and men's hearts have not been broken. They have lived to smile, to wed, to enjoy life much as usual, or old tales are untrue." "Do not jest," said I. "A man's life, a woman's heart, are treasures too precious to win, too perilous to lose. Say you are not in earnest." "Perhaps not," she said lightly. "Yes, you may have your good-night kiss." And we parted. You would not think it was forever. The house party was not large at Kingswood, but it was as much disturbed and excited when our engagement was given out as if it had been a much more exulting gathering. My devotion had not been unmarked, but the betting had been against me. I was too young, too undistinguished. What had I done? Not even in the army. In literature, beyond a few tentative minor successes, I was unknown. How had I presumed to propose to, indeed, to win this belle of the last 2 seasons, the admitted star of the most aristocratic, exclusive, socially distinguished set? I was fairly good-looking. So much was admitted. My family was unimpeachable, old and honored. But where is the money to come from to uphold the dignity and pay the bills of a queen of beauty and fashion such as Adeline Montresor? She had not come down from her room next morning when we men adjourned to the grounds for a smoke and the usual after-breakfast stroll. I was in the stable, examining a strain which had lamed my hunter a few days since, and which had accounted for my presence in the library on that eventful afternoon, when my attention was attracted by an observation made by one man to another who held out the morning paper for his friend to see. "I thought there was something by ordinaire," as our Scottish gardener says. "Death of Sir Reginald Lutterworth. All his money and the lovely place left to his nephew, Valentine Blount, the younger son of Lord Fontenaye." "By Jove," said his friend, "what a throw-in! This accounts for the unaccountable, to put it mildly. The fair Adeline sees something beyond the personal merits of our enthusiastic young friend. A house in town, a place in the country, etc., presented at court, Marlborough House in the future. What girl of the period could say no to such a present, with a still more gorgeous perspective? Certainly not Miss Montresor, nor any of her set. But what about Colonel Delamere? He'll receive a neat, carefully worded note, which being interpreted needs only one word of translation: farewell. Perhaps, to soften the blow, as the phrase runs, something like, "My people so badly off, pressure brought to bear, feelings unchanged, bow to fate," etc. Wonder if she saw it. My man says it's in all the evening papers, but we were so hard at work at bridge that no one thought of looking at them. She couldn't have seen it, unless the maid took it up to her room when she went to dress for dinner. Ha! Didn't think of that. On inquiry, I found that my enslaver and her maid had left for London by the early train. A note had been left for me, containing only a few words. "Dearest, I feel I must go home. See you at Old Acres. Au revoir." I felt disappointed. Still, I had no rational ground for distrust. It was most natural that a girl under such circumstances should wish to go home to her mother and relieve her heart, when such an important step had been decided upon. I sent a telegram in answer, and arranged to leave for London, having to make certain arrangements in accordance with what would doubtless be my altered position. We wrote to one another daily. The letters, although not particularly ardent on her side, were affectionate and apparently sincere. A few days passed in making necessary financial arrangements, in receiving congratulations freely tendered by friends and acquaintances. By my own family, I was regarded as the Spanish galleon laden with treasure, which had come to redeem the faded glories of the estate, and to aid the wearer of a title, unsupported by an adequate income. Life was roseate, with radiant and dazzling splendor. What care I for the wealth? Was I not the proud possessor of the heart of the loveliest girl in England? I was invited to her father's place in the Midlands for the forthcoming hunting season. The kindest semi-maternal letter informed me that darling Adeline had overtaxed her nervous system and had not been quite herself for the last few days. I could understand why. However, she was looking her best once more, and all impatience to greet me at Oldacres next week, when some of their more intimate neighbours would be able to pay their respects. I made a rather wry face at the extra week's delay, thus imposed upon me, but suppressed any impatience as much as was possible, while thinking of the rapturous delight awaiting me at the end of the probation. On the morning of the day I was to leave London, I received another of the extra-legal, important-looking documents with which I had been so familiar lately. I was on the point of throwing it into the drawer of my writing-table to await my return, when I should be able to settle all formal matters in one morning's work. Something, however, urged me to open the bothering thing and to have done with it, so as not to have it hanging over me when I was impatient of business of any sort or kind. I read over the first page twice before I fully grasped its purport. My dear sir, we regret deeply the unpleasant nature of the communication which we are reluctantly compelled to make. We cannot sufficiently express our surprise at the apparent carelessness of Messrs. Stedman and Delve, who have been your uncle's trusted lawyers and agents for 50 years, and in point of fact acted in that capacity for your grandfather, the late Lord Fontenay, and we apologize with sincere regrets for not having verified with greater care the precise nature of Sir Reginald's last will and testament. It now appears that the testator made another will a year after the one by which you were to benefit so largely. That other will has been found in a secret drawer, and is now in the possession of Messrs. Stedman and Delve. By it, all former wills are revoked, and there is a total omission of your name as a beneficiary. With the exception of comparatively trifling annuities and legacies, the whole of the testator's very large estates, together with the sum of £300,000 invested in the 3%, is willed to your elder brother, the present Lord Fontenay. This was a thunderclap. Indeed, apart from the natural distaste felt by most men at having been suddenly displaced from a position of wealth and importance, my chief regret arose from the feeling of disappointment which my change from wealth to moderate competence would cause to my beloved Adeline. No doubt of her loyalty and good faith troubled me. A legacy from my mother provided a sufficient, if not unusual, income, as well as a fair estate upon which we could live in something more than moderate comfort. Surely no girl would hesitate to declare her willingness to share the fortunes of a man to whom she had plighted her troth, though disassociated from the splendor which surrounded the former position. I lost no time in telegraphing to her father the change in our circumstances, at the same time writing a full explanation and requesting a day's delay before visiting Oldacres, on account of necessary arrangements. But little time was lost in telegraphing an answer to my communication. Much shocked by your news. Pleased to await a letter. Miss Montresor much overcome. The first news had been disastrous. The second intimation was unpleasant in tone and suggestion. I could not but regard it as showing a disposition to retreat from the engagement. But was this possible? Even probable? Could I think my adored one guilty of withdrawing her solemnly pledged troth-plight entirely on account of the change of my fortunes from those of a rich man with a historic rent-roll and estates hardly exceeded by those of any English proprietor? Was it then the rents and my 3% to which this angel-seeming creature accepted without reference to the man? It would appear so. My youth and inexperience How inferior in worldly wisdom had they shown me to be to this calculating worldling in garb of an angel of light! If so, of course, it was not fully decided so far. Let the end try the man. I trusted that I should be able to stand up to my fight, heavy and crushing as might be the blow fate had dealt me. But all light and color, all sympathy and with savor of pleasure, so-called, died out of my life. My premonition was but too accurate. Following the statement of my legal adviser's letter, every paper in England had a more or less sensational paragraph to the effect that the announcement of the late Sir Reginald Lutterworth's testamentary disposition was premature and incorrect. The bulk of that gentleman's property, his great estates and large deposits in the funds, goes to Lord Fontenaye, the head of the house. Soon after this, through some channels of intelligence, came a harmless-looking paragraph in the personal column of the court circular. "We are authorized to contradict the report of the engagement of Miss Adeline Montresor to the Honourable Valentine Blount. The arrangement, if any, was terminated by mutual consent." A note of studied politeness from her mother left no doubt on my mind that her daughter's engagement to me, too hastily entered into in the opinion of Mr. Montresor and herself, must now be regarded as finally terminated. Mr. Blount would understand that as no good purpose would be served by an interchange of letters or an interview, he would consult the feelings of the family by refraining from requiring either. Such and so worded in effect was my congé. It was a hard fall, in more than one instance, within my knowledge, a fatal one. Last week, Fortunatus nimium, I had stood on the very apex of human happiness, rich, more than rich, the possessor of historic estates with a commensurate rent-roll, above all ecstatically happy as the fiancé of the loveliest girl in England, high-born, highly endowed, the envy of my compeers, the admired of the crowd. A few short days saw me bereft of all but moderate fortune, reduced in position, socially distrated, discarded by the woman of my passionate adoration. What remained, but as was suggested to the victim of an earlier inrush of disasters, to curse God and die? The teaching of my youth, combined with a substratum of philosophic disdain of the ills of life, forbade the ignominious surrender. I took counsel with my calmer self, with my best friends, made no sign, arranged for regular remittances, and took my passage for South America. How I lived among the wild people and wilder adventures, whom debt and dishonor or bohemian love of freedom had driven from the headquarters of art, civilization, and luxury, may be told some day. Sufficient to say that during the 5 years I lived abroad, much of my unhappiness and despair of life wore off by the slow but sure attrition of the new occupations amongst strange companions. From time to time I sent home articles to scientific societies, which gave me a certain vogue in literary circles. At length, and not until the end of the 6th year of wandering had been reached, a desire arose to see England and my people once more. 6 months after my departure, Adeline had married an elderly peer, when, as Lady Wansborough, she gained the position and consideration which I had been unable to offer her. 2 years afterward, another excitement was caused among the smart set by her elopement with Colonel Delamere, a distinguished military man, said the court circular, concerning whom there had been a growing scandal. Socially condemned, dropped and disowned, what was to be the end of the brilliant woman, whose entertainments, dresses, jewels, and friendships made up so large a part of English and continental chit-chat? Lord Wansborough, without loss of time, obtained a divorce. There was no appearance of the correspondent. Since then, there had been no authentic information about the errant pair, neither, though I searched in the fashion journals with unusual industry, did I come across the marriage of Lord Colonel Delamere to the heroine of so many historiettes in high life. It was not that I had any strong personal interest in her career, fallen as she was now from her high estate finally and irrevocably. But I couldn't attain to complete detachment from all human sympathy for the fallen idol of my youthful dreams, though perhaps my strongest sentiment connected her with was one of heartfelt gratitude for the brusque manner in which she had discarded me and so saved me from the keenest, the most exquisitely cruel tortures to which civilized man can be subjected. Of all the people in the world, she was the last whom I expected, or indeed desired, to see again. Yet we were doomed to meet once more. I told you that I came from Hobart the day after my arrest, save the mark, in a valley from Callao, of which the crew and passengers were strangely mixed, various in character as in color and nationality. South Americans, Mexicans, Americans of the States, both Northerners and Southerners. Among them I noted, although I was far from troubling myself about their histories, a tall, handsome man who bore on him the impress of British military service. It was Colonel Delamere. I could not be mistaken. I had formed a slight acquaintance with him in earlier days, had watched him at cards with some of the least villainous-looking of the foreigners, to whose excitable manner and reckless language his own offered so marked a contrast. I did not intend to make myself known to him, but accident was stronger than inclination. Seeing a lady struggling up to the companion, the weather was still rough, I moved forward and helped her to a seat. She turned to thank me, and after an earnest, surprised glance at my face, "But no, it can't be. Am I so changed," she said reproachfully, "that you don't know Adeline Montresor?" She was changed. Oh, how sadly, and I had not known her. The second time, of course, I recognized the object of my youthful adoration, the woman by whose heartless conduct I had been so rudely disillusioned. She glanced at the colonel, who, engrossed in the game, had not observed her coming on deck, and motioned me to take a seat beside her, saying, "How you have changed since we last met. I treated you shamefully, heartlessly, I confess, but it was all for your own good, as people say to children. You would never have been the man you are if fate and I had not sent you out into the world with a broken heart. Now tell me all about yourself," she continued, with a glance which recalled the spell of the former witchery, harmless now, however, as summer lightning. "You don't wish to cut me, I hope." "Far from it," I replied. "You will always find me a friend. Is there any way in which I can serve you? You have only to say. What is your address?" She looked over at the colonel and his companions with a melancholy air, and replied in a low voice, "We are travelling as Captain and Mrs. Winchester. Poor fellow, he cannot marry me, though he would do so tomorrow if he were free from his wife, as I am from my husband. But she will not go for a divorce, just to punish us. Isn't it spiteful? You can see," here she touched her dress, which was strictly economical, "that all is low water with us. I have tried the stage, and we have been doing light comedy in Callao on the coastal towns. You have seen me in amateur business?" "Yes," I said. "How I admired you." "I know that," she smiled, with a strangely mingled suggestion of amusement and sadness. "You were a first-class lover in the proposal scene, though a little too much in earnest. I really was touched, and if indeed everything had been different, my heart, my previous experiences, my insane love of society triumphs, dress, diamonds, etc. These things I thought I had secured, and so accepted your honest adoration. But even then I was in love with poor Jack. Never loved anyone else, in fact. I have been his ruin, and he mine. I see he's finished his game and is coming over. You may as well know each other." The colonel looked at me fixedly, much wondering at our apparent friendly attitude, then bowed politely and formally. "No, Jack, you don't know him, though you've seen him before. He's an old friend of mine, though, to whom I did a good turn, the best anyone ever did him, when I broke our engagement short off, after hearing he'd lost his money. Now you know." "You are a queer woman," he said, putting out his hand in frank and manly fashion, which I shook warmly. "I always said you treated him brutally. It didn't break his heart, though. It might have suffered at the time. We're all fools. I nearly shot myself when I was just of age over Clara Westbrook." "Yes, I know," assented Mrs. Winchester good-humouredly. "Now she's 18 stone and can hardly get into her carriage." "She was a dashed handsome woman then," pleaded the Colonel. "But hang the past, it's the future we've got to look at. Not a gay prospect either. Some people make money here, I suppose. We were nearly getting off the boat at Hobart, trying our luck at the new silver mine, the Cornstalk or something like that. Do you know anything about it?" "I'm part proprietor, and so on," I said, trying vainly to divest my manner of any trace of importance, cruel as was the contrast between my position and that of this forlorn pair. It was a chance investment when I came out here. "The devil! Tregonwell, Blount, Herbert and Clark. Forgotten your name, you know. Why, they say you're all worth £100,000 each." "At least," I said. "Quite a fluke, though. My partner, Tregonwell, who is a good man of business, wanted to throw it up. I held on out of pure obstinacy, and it turned up a bonanza. Your luck was in, and ours is dead out," said Mrs. Winchester. "There's no denying that, but ours may turn again some day. Where are we going next, Jack?" "Checked through to Coolgardie, West Australia," said the Colonel. "Know some fellows. Believe they are immensely rich gold mines there. Saw some quartz specimens in a window in London, as much gold as quartz." "Quite true. There have been many wonderful yields there," I said. "It's an awful hot place, very primitive and rough. Still, the women—there are ladies too—manage to live and keep up their spirits. What do you say, Addie? Hadn't you better stay behind for a while, at any rate?" "All places are alike to me now," she said wearily. "But where you go, I go. We'll see it out together, Jack." "We're to be in Melbourne tonight, the steward told me," said the Colonel. "Perhaps Mr. Blount would kindly recommend a hotel?" "I know a good one," I said, "handy to your boat. I'll see you on board tomorrow. The Marloo leaves in the afternoon. I can give you letters to some people in the field, as they call it." We went to Scott's, where I arranged certain things with the management, so that when the Colonel paid his bill the next day, and we left together in a cab for the Marloo, he told his wife that the charges were most reasonable. She looked at me with a meaningful glance and wrung my hand as the Colonel hurried off with the luggage. "You're a good fellow," she said, "though it's late in the day to find out. You've had your revenge, haven't you?" "Are you going to get married?" "Yes," I said, "next week." "I wish you joy with all my heart, what there is of it, that is. Is she beautiful, innocent, devoted to you?" "All that," I said, "and more." "Then tell her my story, and when for vanity, pleasure, or the tinsel trappings of society, she is tempted to stray from the simple faith of her youth— I had it once, strange to say— let her think of me as I am now, poverty-stricken, degraded, and, except for poor Jack, whom I have dragged down to ruin with me, without a friend in the world." "While I live," said I, "you must not say that." I know," and the tears fell from her eyes, changed as she was from all that she had been in her day of pride. "But we can take nothing from you, of all men. God bless you." Here came the Colonel. "Come along, Addie. We shall be left behind. Ta-ta, Blount. You're a dashed good fellow. Too good altogether, if you ask me. We'll let you know how we get on." As the coasting steamer churned the far from limpid waters of the Yarra, I waved my hand once and turned my head. They went their way, she and her companion to a rude life and cheerless future, I to love and unclouded happiness, with fortune and social fame thrown in as make-weights. So there you have the whole of it, last dying speech and confession of a sometime bachelor, but henceforth able to proudly describe himself as a married man, like the swell in the witness box, formerly in the army. Edward Bruce came back from Queensland, and for fear of accidents the wedding was solemnized quietly, but with all due form and observance, between Valentine Fitzeustace Blount, bachelor, and Imogen Carrisforth, spinster, of Miranda, in the parish of Tallawatta, district of Upper Sturt, colony of Victoria, Australia. The day was one of those transcendent glories of Summerland, which, as combining warmth with the fresh, dry air of the great Southland, are absolutely peerless. The lightly wooded downs, verdant as in spring this exceptional year, were pleasing to the eye as they stretched away mile after mile to the base of the mountain range. The exotic trees, oaks, elms, with a few beeches, walnuts, and ash trees, hard by the back entrance, were in the fullest leaf, most brilliant greenery. The great willows hung their tresses over the river banks, swaying over the murmuring stream, while they almost covered the channel with their trailing wreaths. The glory of the wattled gold had departed. The graceful, tender, fern-frond appearing chaplets were no longer intertwined with the lavish spring gold which, following the windings of every streamlet in the ravine, seemed to penetrate the dim grey woodlands with golden-threaded devices. Herald and earliest note in tone, and tendril of that manifold, divest harmony the voice of spring. A souvenir of the ocean in the form of a gladsome, whispering breeze came through the woodland at noon, tempering the sun's potent influence, until all comments and criticisms united in one sincerest utterance: an absolutely perfect day, fitting indeed, as the youngest bridesmaid asserted, for such an ideal marriage. Nothing went wrong with train or coach this time. Fate had done her worst, and was minded to hold off from these persistent seekers after happiness. Edward Bruce had arrived from Queensland, sun-browned, rather harder in condition than when he left home, but hale, strong, in good spirits, and even jubilant, having heard by wire of a 6-inch rainfall since his departure. Little River Jack, the O'Hara's brothers, had crowned themselves with glory on Crickle Downs since they had been employed there. Energetic, athletic, and miraculously learned in every department of bush lore, they had thrown themselves into the work of the drought-stricken district with an amount of enthusiasm that rejoiced the manager's heart, moving him to declare that they were worth their weight in gold, and had saved the lives of sheep and cattle to the value of their wages 6 times over. He was going to give Little River Jack the post of overseer at Back Out Station, and felt certain that no one would get hold of a calf, cow, or bullock with the Crickle Downs brand as long as he was in charge. Phelim and Pat O'Hara were kept on the home station, and for driving of a weak flock of sheep at night, or moonlighting the outlying scrub cattle, no one in all Queensland, except Jim Bradfield, was fit to hold a candle to them. It was for various reasons, the bride's recent illness and other consideration, that what is known as a quiet wedding took place, yet were there certain additions to the family circle. Pastoral neighbours such as the McRimmons, the Grants, the Macaulays, the Chesters, the Waterdales could not decently be left out. Besides the seniors, they included large families of young men and maidens born and reared among the forests and meadows of the Upper Sturt. The climatic conditions of this highland region proved its adaptability for the development of the Anglo-Saxon and the Anglo-Celt. For finer specimens of the race than these young people, who rode and drove so joyously to this popular function, would have been difficult, if not impossible, to find. The men, tall, stalwart adepts in every manly exercise, the girls, fresh-coloured, high-spirited, full of the joyous abandon of early youth, as yet unworn by care, and with the instinctive confidence of all healthy-minded young people in the continuance of the joie de vivre, of which they had inherited so large a share. It was noticed by some of these, whose eyes were sharp, and general intelligence by no means limited, that at the breakfast there was a new damsel, who assisted the waiting-maid, Josephine McIntyre, chiefly known as Joe Mac, a smart soubrette of prepossessing appearance. With her the bride and bridegroom shook hands warmly before they departed for good. Well and becomingly dressed, she was an object of more than ordinary interest to some of the youthful squirearchy. "Why, it's Sheila Maguire from Bunjil," said one of the youngsters to his comrade. "Thought I'd seen her before somewhere. Doesn't she look stunning?" "My word," was the reply. "They say she's been left a lot of money by old Barney, her uncle." "She's a fine, straight, jolly girl, with no nonsense about her," declared the first speaker. "A man might do worse than make up to her if he had to live in the back blocks. Why don't you try the experiment?" "Thanks awfully. Hope I shall do as well, but I'm not on the marry just yet. Want to see another Melbourne Cup or so first." There was no marriage bell, yet all went well without absolute summons. Everyone turned up at the right time. Not even the best man was absent. He came the evening before, a cool, unpretending person, very correctly dressed and with "soldier" written all over him, in spite of the vain disguise of mufti. He was presented as Colonel Pelham Villiers, D.S.O., Royal Engineers, just down from northern India. That he had assisted at such functions before was evident by the air of authority with which he put the bridegroom through his facings, and even ordered the bridesmaids about, like a lot of chorus girls, as Susie Allerton observed. She had, she said, a great mind to refuse to obey. But after once meeting the look in the pair of stern-grained eyes, hers were hazel, she capitulated. He took her in to breakfast, it was noticed, where they seemed excellent friends. Punctually at 3 p.m., the drag came round with Edward Bruce on the box, behind such a team as only one station on the upper Sturt could turn out. The leader's own brothers, cheap at 100 apiece, were a dream, as an enthusiastic girl observed, while the solid pair of dark bays in the wheel were scarcely behind them in value. Out came the bride in a travelling suit of grey, on the arm of the happiest man in Australia, as he had that day professed himself to be. Black Paddy noiselessly relinquished the rein of the near-side leader, a fine-tempered but impatient animal, and like one horse, the well-broken, high-mettled team moved off. The road was level and smooth for the first half-mile. Then came a long upgrade, pretty much against collar. The team, at touch of the rein, broke into a hand-gallop, which they kept up easily until the crown of the hill was reached. There, in the long downgrade, high above the river bank on one side and scooped out of the mountainside on the other, the powerful leg brake was applied, and the laden vehicle rolled steadily and well controlled until the level track of the river meadow was reached. There was a full quarter of an hour to spare when the railway station was neared, and with the luggage checked through to Menzies Hotel, Melbourne, and an engaged carriage for Imogen and himself, Mr. Blount decided that the first stage of matrimonial happiness was reached. End of Chapter 9.
Chapter 10, Part 1 of The Ghost Camp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simona Rusu. The Ghost Camp by Rolf BOLDREWOOD. Chapter 10. Hobart, where it was decided to spend the honeymoon, from their joint experience of its unequalled summer climate and picturesque beauty, was reached on the following day. A charming villa by the sad sea waves had been secured for them by a friend, the all-potential personage who ran, so to speak, the social, sporting, and residential affairs of the city, and whose dictum, at once suave and authoritative, no Tasmanian, whether foreign visitor or native-born, was found bold enough to withstand. The bridegroom remembered driving there in a tandem cart, drawn by a refractory pair, which he had reduced to subjection, doing the 12 miles out, at a creditable pace, though not quite in time for dinner. But the view, the isolation, and the forest paths of this ideal private paradise had imprinted themselves indelibly on his memory. As it happened, the person in charge of the cottage was absent, but refreshment was sent in by the housekeeper, which they were in a mood thoroughly to enjoy, looking forward to the many divine repasts which they would share in this enchanting retreat. From the open window of the morning room, looking eastward, they gazed over the south arm of the Derwent, a broad estuary having the cloud effects and much of the spacious grandeur of the ocean. The headland on which the bungalow stood commanded a wide and varied view, in which sea and crag, land and water, were romantically mingled. Scrambling down the cliff by a precipitous path to the beach, they found to their great delight that a raspberry plantation had been formed on the cliff's sheltered slope, much of which was in full bearing. The modified English climate of Tasmania is eminently favourable to the production of the smaller fruits, such as the currant, strawberry, gooseberry, raspberry, and blackberry, this last growing in wild profusion in hedges and over fences. "Oh, how delightful!" cried Imogen, as, seated on a large stone, she applied herself to the consumption of an enticing raspberry feast spread upon a leaf platter, woven deftly by the hands of her husband. "Look at the calm water, the fishing boats, the gulls, the small waves breaking on the beach. Was there ever such an ideal honeymoon lodge? And these lovely raspberries. We can get cream at the house. And what a leaf platter! Where did you learn to make one, sir? You must have had practice." "At Nukuheva. I was stranded there for 6 months once. The girls taught me." "Girls, indeed! That sounds very general and comprehensive. No savage maiden in particular. Quite sure now? No photographs?" "If there was, I've forgotten all about her. I don't keep photographs. There's only one damsel that is imperishably engraved upon heart and soul memory. Ay, this mortal frame, by a totally new process. It has the effect of destroying all former negatives. The best specimens of photography are put to shame and obliterated." "And that is called?" "The last love of the mature man, the answering fondness of the woman, the best love, the true love, the only love which survives the burden of care, the agony of grief, the chances and changes of life, the steady flame which burns ever brighter in the dark depths of despair." "Oh, I dare say fascinating creatures, I suppose. Were they not? I have forgotten all about them. There is one fascination for me henceforth, and one only. It will last me until my life ends or hers. I pray that mine may be the first summons." "Men were deceivers, ever," hummed Imogen, "but I must make the best of it, now I have got you. The fates were against us at first, were they not? What a strange thing is a girl's heart! How short a time it takes to cast itself at a man's feet! How long, long, endless, wretched, unendurable are the days of doubt, grief, anguish, unutterable, if he prove faithless, or the girl has overrated his attachment. It nearly killed me when I thought you had gone away without caring. And suppose I had never returned? I began to believe you had decided not to answer my letters, that Edward had not relented, that you did not care, transient interests, and so on. It is so with many women." "Transient interests!" cried Imogen, jumping up and scattering the raspberries in her excitement. "Why, there was not one single hour from the time you left Marunda till I saw you again that my heart was not full of thoughts of you. Why should I not think of you? You told me you loved me, though it was so short a time since we had met, and my every sense cried out that your love was returned, redoubled in fervour and volume." "How little we know of women and their deeper feelings," mused Blount. "How often you hear of a pair of lovers that he or she has changed their mind. The ordinary platitudes are rehearsed to friends and acquaintances. When they separate, perhaps forever, the outside world murmurs cynically, better before marriage than after, and the incident is closed." "Closed, yes," answered Imogen, "because one heart is bleeding to death." While rambling through the old house, which was handsomely furnished, though not in modern fashion, they came upon a morning room, which had evidently been regarded as a fitting apartment for treasures of art and literature, etchings, etc. In it was a bookcase containing old and choice editions. The dates, those of the last century, told a tale of the family fortunes, presumably at a higher level of position than in these later days. A dour chest of oak was rubbed over, and the inscription deciphered. A few rare etchings were noted and appreciated. Through these the lovers went carefully hand in hand, Blount, who was a connoisseur of experience, pointing out to Imogen any special value or acknowledged excellence. When suddenly letting go her hand, he rushed over to a dim corner of the room, where he stopped in front of an oil painting, evidently of greater age and value than the other pictures. "Yes," he said, first carefully removing the dust from the left-hand corner of the canvas, under which, though faint and indistinct, the name of a once famous artist, with a date, could be distinguished. "I thought so. It is a Romney. He was famed for his portraits. But what a marvellous coincidence! Perfectly miraculous! I was told that in Tasmania I should fall across curious survivals, as at one time the emigration of retired military and naval officers was officially stimulated by the English government. The promise of cheap land and labour, that of assigned servants, as they were called, in a British colony with a mild climate and fertile soil, attracted to a quasi-idyllic life those heads of families whose moderate fortunes forbade enterprise in Britain. Special districts such as Westbury and New Norfolk were indicated as peculiarly adapted for fruit and dairy farms. "I remember quite well," said Imogen, "when I was here at school in Hobart, that many of the girls belonged to families such as you mention. Such nice people, with grand old names, but so very, very poor. The parents were not the sort to get on in a new country, though the sons as they grew up mostly altered that state of affairs. But they did not remain in Tasmania. No, they went to Queensland, New Zealand, or Victoria till they made money. Then they generally returned to marry an old sweetheart and settle down for life near Launceston or Hobart. They were very patriotic and awfully fond of their dear little island. But what is all this coincidence? You seem quite excited about it." "Will you have the goodness to look at this picture, Mrs. Blount?" "I am looking," said she. "It must be a very lifelike portrait of somebody, and how beautifully painted. Quite a gem, evidently. The more you look at it, the more lifelike it appears. What lovely blue eyes! A girl in the glory of her youthful graces. I mustn't add airs, I suppose, for fear of being thought cynical. But the expression must have been caught with amazing fidelity, stamped, as it were, forever. I suppose it is very valuable?" "If it is the portrait which I have reason to believe it is, its value is great. The original was found in an old manor house belonging to the De Cliffords. The house, once a king's, though not untenanted, was let to people unacquainted with art, and had been so neglected as to be almost in ruins. The owner of the estate, an eccentric recluse, was a very old man. He refused to have any of the furniture removed, or the paintings taken down from the walls. At his death, people were permitted to view the place, which was afterwards sold. Their heir at law turned everything he could into money, and emigrated to Tasmania. Quite the proper thing to do. We did something of the same sort, whereof the aforesaid Imogen. I was so described in my settlement, met with one Blount, and marrying him, became the happiest girl in Australia or out of it, didn't she?" Blount responded appropriately. It would seem convincingly, for the dialogue was resumed as they again went out. She desired to know why and wherefore this particular portrait was so very precious. Other young women, doubtless, in that long-dead time, had had their portraits painted. "Because this is the very picture, I am almost certain, which inspired Robert Montgomery with those lovely lines of his, 'To the portrait of an unknown lady.' Have you never read them?" "No, I have heard someone speak of them, though. Well, the picture disappeared before the sale. The family would never explain. There was evidently some mystery, painful or otherwise, connected with it. Montgomery's lines had made it famous, and it was a disappointment to intending buyers, many of whom came long distances to bid for it. Rather a long story, but wildly interesting. To think that we should have come across it on our wedding trip, and here, of all places. Well, as a punishment for your taking so much interest in an unknown lady, you shall repeat the lines. I dare say you know them by heart." "I think I do. At any rate, I know the leading ones. If there are more, we can read them together afterwards." "Image of one who lived of yore, hail to that lovely mien, once quick and conscious, now no more, on land or ocean seen, were all life's breathing forms to pass before me in Agrippa's glass, many as fair as thou might be, but oh, not one like thee. Here the girl's head sank on her lover's shoulder, and as her slender form reclined with the unconscious abandon of a child against his breast, while his arm wound closely and yet more closely around her yielding waist, "Oh, go on, my darling, let me hear it all," she murmured. "Thou art no child of fancy, thou, the very look dost wear, that gave enchantment to a brow, wreathed with luxuriant hair, lips of the morn, embalmed in dew, and eyes of evening's starry blue. Of all that e'er enjoyed the sun, thou art the image of but one. And who was she in virgin prime, and May of womanhood, whose roses here, unplucked by time, in shadowy tints have stood, while many a winter's withering blast hath o'er the dark cold chamber passed, in which her once resplendent form slumbered to dust beneath the storm? Of gentle blood upon her birth consenting planets smiled, and she had seen those days of mirth which frolic round the child. To bridal bloom her youth had sprung, behold her beautiful and young. Lives there a record which hath told that she was wedded, widowed, old? How long the date? 'Twere vain to guess. The pencil's cunning art can but one single glance express, one motion of the heart, a smile, a blush, a transient grace of air and attitude and face. One passion's changing colour makes, one moment's flight for ages fix. Where dwelt she, ask yon aged oak, whose boughs embowered the lawn? Whether the bird's wild minstrelsy woke her here at dawn? Whether beneath its youthful shade at noon in infancy she played? If from the oak no answer come, of her all oracles are dumb. There are more verses. I will show you the poem so that you may enjoy the spirit of it. It was a favourite of mine since boyhood, and now I see the crests of the waves towards the southern skyline rearing higher. The sea breeze is often chill. Suppose we scramble up the path and go inside? What a lovely view, and what delicious verses, cried the girl. Shall we always be as happy as we are now? I feel as if I did not deserve it, and I am lost in wonder and admiration at the supernatural state of bliss in which I find myself, answered Blount. I ought to throw something of value into the deep to avert the anger of Nemesis. Here goes. And before Imogen could prevent him, he had unfastened the bangle which he wore on his wrist, and hurled it far into the advancing tide. Let us hope that no fish will swallow it and return it, through the agency of the cookmaid. Now I call that wasteful and superstitious, quoth Imogen, pretending to be angry. You will need all the silver in the South Pacific Comstock if you throw about jewelry in that reckless fashion. And who gave you that bangle, may I ask? You never showed it to me. I won it in a bet long ago. The agreement was that whoever won was to wear the bangle till he or she was married. After that they might dispose of it as they thought fit. I forgot all about it till today. So this seemed an auspicious hour, and I sacrificed it to the malign deities. And this is man's fidelity, quoted Imogen. For of course it was a woman. Confess, didn't your heart give a little throb as you pitched away the poor thing's gift? The poor thing, as you call her, is happily married to a first-class earl that keeps his carriage. I dare say she's forgotten my name, as I nearly did that of the possessor of the bangle. The allotted term of happiness passed at the Hermitage, for such had been the name given to it by the original owner, who lived there for the last remaining years of a long life, too quickly came to an end. For happiness it surely was, of the too rare exquisitely attempered quality, undisturbed by regrets for the past or forebodings for the future. Such wounds and bruises of the heart as he had encountered, though painful, even in a sense agonizing at the time, were of a nature to be cured by the subtle medicaments of the old established family physician, time. They were not his fault, so to speak. Such sorrows and smarts are not of the nature of incurable complaints. The agony abates. The healthful appetite in youth for variety, for change of scene, the solace of bodily exercise, and the competition with new intelligences extinguish morbid imaginings. thus leaving free the immortal genius of youth to range amid the unexplored kingdoms of romance, where in defiance of giants and goblins he is yet fated to discover and carry off the fairy princess. "And I did discover her, darling, didn't I?" said he, fondly pressing her hand, which lay so lovingly surrendered to his own, as after a long stroll through the fern-shadowed glades of the still untouched primeval forest, they came in sight of the hermitage, and halted to watch the breakers rolling on the beach below the veranda, where during their first delirium they had so often watched the moon rise over a summer sea. "All very well, sir," replied Imogen with a bright smile which irradiated her countenance like that of a joyous child, but the carrying off hung fire, to return to the prose of daily life, until the princess became apprehensive lest she might not be carried off at all, and was minded to set out to reverse the process and carry off the knight. How would that have sounded? What a death-blow to all the legends of chivalry! The page's dress would be rather a difficulty, wouldn't it? Fancy me appearing amongst all those nice girls and men at Hollywood Hall, inquiring too for a gentleman of the name of Blount. I hardly did know your name then, which would have been a drawback. I am tall enough for a page, though, and could have arranged the clustering ringlets, rich and rare, like poor Constance de Beverley. How I wept for her when I was a schoolgirl, little thinking that I should have to weep bitter tears for myself in days to come." "And did she weep, my heart's treasure, in her true knight's absence?" "Weep?" cried she, while in the midst of her mockery and simulated grief the true tears filled her eyes at the remembrance. "Wept enough to extinguish a beacon light. I took to reading dear Sir Walter Scott again in sheer desperation. Ivanhoe and Rob Roy saved my life, I really believed, when I was recovering from that influenza. Oh, how wretched I was! As the Strut, the dear old river, flowed before my window, more than once I thought what a release it would be from all but unendurable pangs. I don't wonder that women drown or hang themselves in such a case. I knew of one, yes, 2 instances, poor things." "Any man?" "Yes, 2 also. So the numbers are even. We don't seem to be growing cheerful, though, do we? I feel just a little tired. Afternoon tea must be nearly ready. There's nothing left for us now, as Stevenson says. Not even suicide, only to be good. A fine resolve to finish up with. Let us seal the contract, those who are in favour, etc." Carried unanimously. The day's post brought a letter from Mr. Tregonwell, which, like a stone thrown into a pond, disturbed the smoothness of their idyllic life. An incursion of the emissaries of fate was imminent. Mr. Blount's presence was absolutely, urgently necessary at the mine. There was industrial trouble brewing. The wages men, as those labourers at a mine are called, who are not shareholders, had increased necessarily to a large number. They wanted higher pay, the weather being bad and the discomforts considerable. The British shareholders were in a majority on the London board and were beginning to make their power felt. No serious dispute, but better to arrange in time. Would have come himself to Hobart, but thought it imprudent at present to leave the mine. Very rich ore body just opened out. Prospects absolutely wonderful. Sorry to bother him, but business urgent. "What a terrible man," moaned Imogen. "Wherever we are he will always be coming suddenly down upon us and destroying our peace of mind. I suppose, however, that he is a necessary evil. He is a first-rate worker and very prudent withal, but to show the element of luck in these matters, it is to my decision, not his, that we retain the share which is now likely to become a fortune." "Oh, but there must be some special quality among your bundle of qualities which you are so fond of decrying," said Imogen with wifely partiality. "Some quick insight into the real value of things, which is in so many cases superior to mere industry and perseverance." "There must be," said Blount, thoughtfully accepting the compliment, "or how should I have secured one priceless treasure to which all the mines of Golconda are but as pebbles and withered leaves?" "What treasure? Oh, flatterer," said the girl. "How you have capped my poor but honest belief in you. Well, time alone must tell how this particularly clever human investment is going to turn out. It won't do for this lady to protest too much. Now, where shall I stay until my knight returns from the war? In Hobart, I should say most decidedly. It is a cheerful city at this season of year. The coolness of the summer, the charm of the scenery, the cheerfulness of the society, this being the place for 6 other colonies. Any chance of Mrs. Bruce coming over? Suggests the idea. Perhaps she might. Tell her I have taken a cottage between Sandy Bay and Brown's River for her specially, one of the loveliest suburbs. If she'll come over and take care of you, I shall be eternally indebted to her for the 2nd time. You remember the first? How good she was. But for her, etc. She must come as our guest and bring Black Paddy and Polly and the babies for off-side groom and nursery maid. That's good Australian, isn't it? Nearly equal to Banjo Patterson. Stuff and nonsense. Australians talk the purest English, rather better in fact than the home-grown article. But oh, how I should love to have her here and the dear chicks. Edward could come for her afterwards. So that was settled. Mrs. Bruce, replying, wrote that Edward had given her leave to come for a couple of months. It was really getting very hot and baby was pale. He, Edward, not the baby, was going to Sydney on business, thought of selling out of Queensland, so would cross over and spend the end of the visit with them. These arrangements were carried out. Mrs. Bruce, with her servants and children, were safely bestowed at the pretty villa at Sandy Bay, where Black Paddy, as groom and coachman, and Polly, as under-nursemaid, excited as much attention as Mrs. Huntingdon Ayah from Madras. Mr. Blount was free to depart from the South Pacific Comstock Proprietary, which included a decided change from these Arcadian habitudes. Arrived at Strahan, he perceived various improvements, which he correctly attributed to Tregonwell's boundless energy and aroused imagination. Long stretches of corduroy, regularly repaired, rendered the transit business comparatively free from difficulty. Great gangs of men were employed in clearing the track for the projected railway. The work of piercing the forest was tremendous. The great size of the trees, a scientist had measured 180 feet in circumference. The density and confused nature of the jungle, through which the way had almost to be tunnelled, if such an expression can be applied to operations above ground, retarded progress. The masses of fallen timber at the sides of the track, the whole laborious task carried on under ceaseless rain, was sufficient to overtask the energies of all but the stubborn, resistless Anglo-Saxon. But on the mining fields of Australasia, if but the precious metal, gold, silver, or copper, be visible, or even believed to be within reach in sufficient quantities, no toil, no hardship is sufficient to daunt a resolute miner. Neither heat nor cold, the burning dust storms of Broken Hill, the icy blasts that sweep from the solitudes of Cape Nome over the frozen soil of Klondike, have power to stay the conquering march of the men, of the women of our race, or slake the thirst for adventure which is as the breath of their nostrils. So, by the time Mr. Blount arrived on the scene after a single day's journey from the coast, the melodramatic action of a progressive mining town was in full blast. The hotels and stores were comparatively palatial. Tall weatherboard buildings with balconies enabled the inmates to gaze over the waving ocean of tree-tops and to mark where the jungle had been invaded by the pioneer's axe, that primary weapon of civilization. The streets, miry and deep-rooted, had yet sidewalks with wooden curbs, which provisionally, at any rate, preserved the foot passengers from the slough into which the ceaseless trampling of bullocks, horses and mules had worn the track. As in all such places in their earlier stages, money was plentiful, wages were high, labor was scarce. The adventurers who came to inspect the field necessarily brought capital with them. Under the Mining Act and regulations of the colony, allotments had been marked out in the principal streets to be acquired by purchase or lease. Legal occupation had succeeded the early scramble for possession. A progress committee had been formed, precursor of municipal action, of which Mr. Tregonwell, of course, was the elected president. Its members advised the government of the day of urgently necessary reforms, or demanded such with no lack of democratic earnestness. Behind all this life and movement, there was the encouraging certainty that the still increasing richness of the principal mine, the original shares in which rose to a height almost unprecedented. Among other necessities of civilization, a newspaper had of course been established. The Comstock Clarion subserved its purpose by clear type, smart local intelligence, and accurate reviews of all mining enterprises from Australia to the ends of the earth. Having been waited upon by the editor without loss of time, Mr. Blount found himself thus presented to an intelligent and enterprising public, a distinguished visitor. Yesterday morning we had the honor of welcoming to our thriving township a gentleman to whose courage and enterprise the public of Comstock are indebted for the inception of a great national industry, the founding of a city fated to rival, if not surpass, in wealth and population both Hobart and Launceston. Mr. Blount courteously supplied, in answer to our request, the following interesting notes of his original connection with a great mine in which he owns a controlling interest. Visiting Tasmania en route for England, a few years since, he was offered shares in a newly prospected silver mine. Mr. Tregonwell was then associated with him in mining ventures. The partners were offered a half share in the claim newly taken up of Ormond's ground, Messrs. Herbert and Clark owning the remainder. Mr. Tregonwell, though experienced and sanguine, of which qualities we have ample proof before our eyes, advised the rejection of the show. Mr. Blount, for a reason not stated, was firm in retaining it. He was in a position to find the cash for payment or lease application, rents and working expenses until the discovery of the richest silver lode south of the line was an accomplished fact. Si monumentum queris circumspice. The Latin quotation was inappropriate, inasmuch as it was not proposed to erect any kind of memorial structure in honor of Mr. Blount, but it looked well, and few of the readers of the Clarion were critical. However, the article had the effect of directing all eyes to the visitor, unobtrusively dressed as he was whenever he appeared. He was, of course, feted and invited to banquets given by leading citizens or mining celebrities. The financial condition of the mine was eminently satisfactory, even brilliant. It held a high place among British investors and foreign syndicates. Members even of the British Parliament did not disdain to take passages in the P&O or Messageries boats for the special purpose of inspecting the wonderful mine. They returned laden with lumps of ore, being fragments of a silver mountain, which they had seen with their eyes and driven a peek into when personally conducted by the American mining captain, who received £5,000 a year salary and was promised another £1,000 should things continue to go well. As the season had advanced, the weather even in that austere and dreadful wilderness relaxed its icy grip. The forest trees, the giant eucalypts and towering pines, had a tinge of softer green. The moss looked bright, touched by the footsteps of spring, haunting even that unlovely wild. Mr. Blount, though loyally impatient to return to his Imogen and the calm delights of Hobart, felt distinctly in better spirits. He even took a mild gratification in marking the heterogeneous element of the stranger hordes that arrived daily, gathered as they were from the ends of the earth, of all nations apparently, and several colours, gentle and simple, forlorn workers and wayfarers from many a distant land, mingled with derelicts of the classes akin to Mr. and Mrs. Winchester, the men feverishly anxious to strike some lucky find or chance investment, the women poorly dressed, working at the humblest household tasks, all wearing the vague, yearning, half-despairing expression which comes with the heart-sickness of hope deferred. Theirs was a harder lot. Still, with but few exceptions, they faced the rude living and unaccustomed toil with the courage women invariably show when hard fortune makes a call on their noble attributes. Nowhere is the ascent of the upgrade of mining prosperity when the tide of fortune is flowing and the financial barometer is set fair, made easier than in Australasia. Rude as may be the earlier stages, the change from the mining camp, the collection of rude cabins, to the town, the city even, is magically rapid. To the gold or silver deposit, as the case may be, everything is attracted with resistless force as by the lodestone mountain of Sinbad. Time, distance, the rude approach by land travel, the stormy seas, all are defied, and though delays and dangers are so thickly strewn before the path of the adventurer, he and his like invariably arrive at their goal, and would get there somehow, if behind every tree stood an armed robber, and were every trickling creek a turbulent river. End of chapter 10, part 1. Chapter 10, Part 2 of The Ghost Camp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simona Rusu. The Ghost Camp by Rolf BOLDREWOOD. Chapter 10. Mr. Tregonwell had proved himself capable of carrying out the rather extensive program, financial and otherwise, which he had produced for the inspection of his partners on their first meeting at the mine. The manager of worldwide experience and unequalled reputation had been procured from America, had been paid a liberal salary, had proved himself more than worthy of his fame. The railway to Strahan was in process of completion. Contracts, let at many different points, were nearing one another with startling rapidity. The price of provisions had fallen, wages were high, yet the contractors were making as much money as the shareholders. With the exception of the very poor and the chronic cases of ill luck, from which no community is, ever has been, or ever will be free, the Great Silver Field was the modern exemplar of a place where everyone had all that he wanted now, and was satisfied that such would be the case for the future. The wages misunderstanding had been settled, an arrangement made with one of the most stable banks in Australia, by which the directors agreed to cash Mr. Tregonwell's drafts for all reasonable and indeed unreasonable amounts, as some overcautious narrow-minded people considered. The predominant partner began to revolve the question of an early departure. The juniors, Charlie Herbert and Jack Clerk, had earned golden opinions from Tregonwell as cheerful workers and high-couraged comrades. He willingly agreed to their holidays at Christmas time, now drawing nigh, if one would remain with him for company and perhaps assistance in time of need, while the other enjoyed himself among his relatives and friends in one of the charming country houses of his native land. As for himself, he did not require change or recreation. His duty was to the shareholders, who had entrusted him with such uncontrolled powers of dictatorship. Mr. Blount would be within easy reach of telegrams at Hobart, whence he could come up for a week when a difficult point or question of further outlay needed to be settled. Comstock was not such a very uncomfortable place now, and would be less so in the near future, and Frampton Tregonwell had lived and thriven amid worse surroundings. So, as the short summer of the West Coast crept slowly on towards the great festival, which heralds peace on earth and goodwill towards men, all things seemed moving in a tranquil, orderly manner towards organized success and permanent prosperity. The big mill, with the newest improvements and a high-grade German scientist from Freiburg in command, had just been completed and was turning out unprecedented returns. Everything went smoothly, socially and otherwise. Although so near to what had once been an accumulation of the most desperate criminals the world could show, only kept under by the merciless uniformity of a severe administration, the present crime record was curiously low and trifling in extent. Labour was well paid, well fed and lodged. All men had, moreover, the hope of ever greater benefits as results from their toil. Under these circumstances the list of offences is invariably light. The inducements to crime were so small as almost to lead to an optimistic belief that incursions on the goods and persons of neighbours would at an early date cease and determine. The dream of the philanthropist would at last be fulfilled. Perhaps also that other dream of a socialistic division of labour with equal partition of the fruits of the earth, and the partition of the fruits of labour, chiefly other men's labour, for the benefit of the poor but honest worker, would be an accomplished fact. So, in the ordering of things mundane, it came to pass that Mr. Blount, to his great contentment and satisfaction, had everything arranged and fixed up, as Tregonwell expressed it, calling his phrases from all nations and many tongues, and departing via Strahan, bade farewell for the present to Macquarie Harbour, Hell's Gates, and the other lonely and more or less historic localities. The passage, for a wonder, was smooth, the wind fair, and it was with joy and satisfaction, which he could hardly forbear expressing in a shout of exultation, that he found himself once more in Hobart, within arm's length, so to speak, of Imogen and his kingdom by the sea. That young woman had kept herself well informed as to the time when the Strahan steamer might be expected, and appeared at the wharf driving the mail phaeton. Black Paddy was beside her on the box. In front was the bay mare, Matchless, with her mate, Graceful, in top condition, and ready to jump out of their skins with rest and good keep. This valuable animal, formerly hard-worked, with but little rest and far from luxurious fare, had been contented to rattle up and down the hills between Hobart and Brown's River and the Huon, without so much as a hint from the whip. Under present circumstances, she naturally took a little holding. But Imogen and Mrs. Bruce had been accustomed to ride and drive almost as soon as they could walk. With great nerve and full experience, fine hands and unequalled knowledge of the tempers and dispositions, management and control of all sorts and conditions of horses, very few secrets of the noble animal, whether in saddle or harness, were hidden for them. So when Imogen drove up to the Tasmanian Club where her husband had temporarily deposited himself, his specimens and belongings generally, he had no misgivings as to the complacency of his charioteer, nor did he offer, as most men would have done, to take the reins himself. "How well they look," he remarked after the first greeting. "Matchless has fallen on her legs in coming to this establishment. Does she give any trouble in her altered condition?" "Hardly any, only she doesn't like waiting now there is no cab behind her. Burra, Paddy, mine think it mare plenty saucy directly." That swart retainer understood the position, and helping the club servant with the heaviest trunk onto the back seat, stepped up beside it with noiseless agility, while at the same moment Matchless and Graceful moved off with regular speed, which soon landed them at home, a word which Mr. Blount pleased himself by repeating more than once. "Hilda looks just as she did," said he, "when I first saw her at Maroondah. I admired her then, I admire her now. How little I thought that I should see her again, as a sister-in-law, or that a certain vision of delight was to burst upon my sight so soon afterwards." "I remember how you stared," said Imogen, "almost rudely indeed, didn't you?" "First of all, I didn't know that Mrs. Bruce had a sister in the house. Secondly, when the girl aforesaid appeared, unexpectedly, in all her fresh and smiling loveliness, pardon my partiality, I was completely knocked over, so to speak, and couldn't help a sort of rapt gaze, as at a wood nymph, which you unkindly call staring. I fell in love at first sight, as men say, deep, deeper, miles deep next morning, and so will remain till my life's end." "I'm afraid it goes rather like that with me, if I must confess," admitted Imogen, "though the heroine of a modern novel would never have behaved so badly, now would she?" "All's well that ends well," said the returned voyager. "I'll hold the horses while you run in, Paddy." The luggage having been taken in, Paddy ascended nimbly and drove soberly round to the stable. Christmas having actually arrived, it was the commencement of the season in Hobart and Tasmania generally. The dear little island, so true an epitome of the ancestral isle, in the climatic conditions, in the stubborn independence of the population, in the incurious, unambitious lives of the rural inhabitants, was filled with strangers and pilgrims from every colony in Australasia. Persons in search of health, haggard men from the Queensland Never-Never country, the far below than the Gulf, where hostile blacks and fever decimated the pioneers. Outworn prospectors from West Australia, a rainless, red-hot, dust-tormented region, where, incredible as it may appear, the water is charged for separately, as well as the whisky. Commercial, pastoral, and legal magnates, whose overtaxed brain carved little save rest and coolness, contented to lie about inhaling the evening breeze, to read, to fish, to muse, to think maybe of a heaven where lawyers' clerks, even with briefs, were not admitted. Sailors, too, from the half-dozen men of war from the South Pacific Fleet, having run ashore and playing their part nobly, as is their wont on land, in all picnics, balls, and cricket matches, even in drives to the Huon River nearly 50 miles out and back. This was rather an object lesson for British tourists as to the capabilities of Australian horses and Australian drivers, inasmuch as the leading drag with 4 horses, hired from a well-known livery stable proprietor and driven by a native-born Tasmanian, negotiated the 50-mile stage, allowing 2 hours for luncheon and boating on the river, between breakfast time and dusk, the whole being performed not only without distress to the well-bred team, but with safety to the passenger and satisfaction to the looker-on. The road was by no means of average description. Far from level indeed, having shuddering deeps, where it wound along hillsides and sudden turns and twisted at right angles when the leaders ran across a deep in the gully which crossed the road, and the wheelers had their heads turned at right angles to the leaders. Then the downgrade towards the sea on the return trip, when the heavily laden coach rolled, lurching at times near the edge of the precipice, and the boldest held their breath for a time. But through every change and doubtful-seeming adventure, in darksome forest and ferny glade, where the light of heaven was obscured, the watchful eye and sure hand of the charioteer guided team and coach with practised ease and assured safety. Then the race meeting, to which you went by land or water, as taste inclined, the deep-sea fishing in the harbour, or the streams so clear and cold in summer, where the trout lay under bridge or bank, and when skies were dull, took the fly much as in Britain. The hunting with country packs, the shooting, the long walks over hill and dale, the halts, when a peep through the forest glades showed a decent view of the foam-crested ocean. What joyous days were those, when with Imogen by his side, who walked as well as she rode and drove, they started with a few picked friends for that exceptional piece of exercise which includes the ascent of Mount Wellington. It is an alpine feat, only to be attempted by the young and vigorous in the springtime of life. The way is long, the mountains steep, and if limbs and lungs are not in good order, the pedestrian is sure to tire halfway, to collapse ingloriously before the summit is reached. Rough in some places is the track over the ploughed fields, so-called painful march. A sprained ankle may easily result from a slip, or worse even, a dislocated knee, most tedious and troublesome of the minor injuries, and which has lamed for life ere now the too confident pedestrian. Another danger to be feared is the sudden envelopment by the mountain mist under the confusing conditions of which more than one person has lost his way and his life, perishing in some unnamed retreat. No such dangers affrighted Imogen and her husband. They reached the summit, and standing there, hand in hand, beheld the unrivalled scene. High over forest and valley they gazed o'er the boundless ocean plain, so still and shining, 3,000 feet below them. The forest, with apparently a level surface above its umbrageous eucalypts, looked like a toy shrubbery. The city nestled between the sea wall and the enormous mountain bulk, under whose shadow it lay. The busy population looked small as the denizens of a populous ant-hill. "It is a still day, grâce à Dieu," said Blount. "There's no tyrannous south wind from the ocean, coming apparently straight from the ice-fields of the pole, to chill us to the bone, and cause the poor forest trees to cry and groan aloud in their anguish. Wind has its good points, probably, but I confess to a prejudice against the Euroclydon variety, especially when we are doing this alpine business. By the way, there is Mr. Wendover's delightful woodland chalet only a mile away. Suppose we make a call there." "I scorn to acknowledge myself tired," said Imogen, "but raspberries and cream, this is the season, would be an appropriate incident on this day of days. They recall the Hermitage, do they not? I can't say more." "And Mrs. Wendover is so charmingly hospitable," said a girl companion. "She has always the newest books, and music too, which, with the before-mentioned raspberries, takes one far in the pursuit of happiness." "While youth and the good digestion, which waits on appetite, last," said a middle-aged person with a bright eye and a generally alert expression. "Youth is the great secret. Heaven forbid that any of this good company should confess to a hint of middle age, but I have a haunting dread lest the world's best choice should be stealing away from me." "Are there not compensations, Captain Warrender?" asked the lady whose refined intellectual cast of countenance suggested literature. "Think how delightful to hear of one's last new book being rushed for new editions, and simply being devoured all over the world." Success is pleasant in whatever state of life it comes to one, but were I allowed to choose between reading and writing, my vote would be distinctly in favor of the former. The delightful self-complacency with his task which the author of a successful book is supposed to fill is overrated, I assure you. It becomes a task, like all other compulsory labor, and there are so many times and seasons when one would much rather do something else. The chief, almost the only valuable result to the producer, except the money, which of course is not despised, is that the reputation of successful authorship brings with it a host of agreeable acquaintances, and even some true and lifelong friendships. "Have you found other authors free from envy, malice, and so forth?" asked Mrs. Allendale. "I can truly say that I have, with the rarest exceptions. Now and then a man writing on party lines will administer a dose of unkind, perhaps unfair criticism, which he calls slanting your book. But there is little real ill nature in the article, however much you may feel annoyed at the time, and the freemasonry which exists among literary people, great and small, makes on the whole for friendly relations. A man saying, 'Oh, you wrote Coconuts and Cannibals, didn't you?' had rather a run when it came out. Queer place to live in, I should think. Then you foregather and become, as it were, the honorary member of a club. Not that one volunteers this information, but it leaks out. 'Oh, here is the chalet gate, and I see Mrs. Wendover's pet Jersey cow, Lily Langtry,' said Miss Chetwynd. 'How nice she looks among the red and white clover. Puts one in mind of dear old England, doesn't it?' 'Where you never were,' laughed another maiden of the Happy Isle. 'I know that, but I've read so much about the grand old country that I can fancy everything. Dear Miss Mitford, what a lovely touch she has. I shall go there some day if I live. In the meantime, here comes Mrs. Wendover. All smiles, welcome, and a picture hat, dear creature. I wonder what Miss Mitford would have thought of this forest, which comes up so close to the house, if she had seen it. I should be afraid of a fire some day.' 'Oh, our forests don't burn so badly, even when they are on fire. This place is safe enough. Sunburn is our worst danger just now, and there's a naval ball this evening. My cheeks are on fire. Just feel them.' 'Oh, certainly, Miss Chetwynd,' said a small middy who was on the party. 'Anything else I can do for you?' 'I was not speaking to you, Mr. Harcourt. I was replying to Clara Mildmay, and I shall cancel the dance I promised you this evening if you're not more respectful.' 'Oh, here you are!' cried Mrs. Wendover in accents of genuine welcome. 'This is the most lucky chance. You must all positively stay to lunch. I was getting tired of my own company for once in a way.' John had sent a messenger to say that he would not come out till the evening, so you are evidently sent by Allah to cheer my loneliness." "We should all be charmed," replied Imogen, taking her place as chief chaperone. "But it is simply impossible. Captain Warrender will tell you that we are all going to the naval ball this evening, and by the time we get to Hobart we shan't have a minute to spare, to dress in time and get the sunburn off our faces. Then you must come in and have raspberries and cream. It's quite a charity to take them off our hands. Walter and Nora and I are going to the ball too, so I must insist." Cooled and refreshed, indeed invigorated by the raspberries and Jersey cream, with suitable accompaniments, the jocund crew bade adieu to their hostess, and trooped off to the Fairy Bower, that fern-shaded trysting place in the heart of the forest, dear to so many generations of holiday folk, where the four-in-hand drag awaited them by the fountain, and bore them safely to their several destinations. The naval ball was a pronounced success. Could it be otherwise? Manned by officers of the half-dozen men-of-war then in harbour. The band, the waiters at the buffet, the assistants who held the dividing line in the ballroom, the attendants at the doors of the supper-room, were all in uniform, while the epaulets and profusion of gold lace lit up the mass of civilian costumes. It was a contention seriously debated at the time and never satisfactorily settled as to whom the honour of being the belle of the ball should be awarded. But all agreed that the crown of the Queen of Beauty, if there had been a tournament, as in the days of chivalry, at which to present it, should have been awarded either to Mrs. Blount, née Imogen Carrisforth, or to Miss Leslie, a native-born Tasmanian, whose complexion was held to be unapproachable south of the line, and whose preeminence in loveliness had never before been disputed. Each had their partisans, sworn admirers and liegemen. Each was declared to be the prettiest girl or the handsomest woman in Australasia, for the New Zealand competitor took a lot of beating, as an ardent youthful admirer phrased it. It remained, however, undecided, and will probably be reviewed, like other vexed questions from time to time, with similar lack of finality. As to one thing, however, the unanimity was pronounced and decisive: the success of the entertainment. When God Save the Queen was played, it was nearer 3 o'clock in the morning than 2, and all but the most inveterate dancers had had enough of it. Some of the junior divisions indeed petitioned for just one more waltz and a galop, but discipline being the soul of the Navy as well as the Army, the Admiral's fiat had decided the matter irrevocably. Carriages were ordered, shawls and wraps were donned by the matrons and maids who had seen it out, as their partners expressed it, and the curtain fell upon one of the most successful comedies or melodramas, as the case may be, still popular, as in old historic days, on the mirthful, mournful, but ever mysterious stage of human life. After this crowning joy came a succession of fêtes, meetings of the racing and polo clubs, with a gymkhana arranged by the latter society, also picnics and private parties, the garden party in the lovely grounds of Government House, where that befitting architectural ornament overlooks the broad winding reaches of the Derwent. All this had to be attended and availed of. The great events of the polo club, in potato and bucket race, when the competitors were compelled to dismount, pick up a potato from the ground, and deposit the same in a bucket placed for the purpose; as also the tandem race, when the aspirant riding one horse had to drive another with long reins before him, also to negotiate a winding in and out course before returning to the starting point, were both won by an active young squatter from the Upper Sturt, to the unconcealed joy of Mrs. Bruce and Imogen, the latter race indeed after a very close finish with a naval officer, who was the recognized champion at this and other gymkhana contests. But won it was by the pastoral champion, though only by a nose. So after an inquiring meeting by the committee of the club, it was to him adjudged, and the trophy borne off in triumph. It is not to be supposed that the squirearchy of the land was unrepresented at these Isthmian games, or that under such circumstances they left their wives and daughters, aunts and cousins behind, or if such an unnatural piece of selfishness had been for a moment contemplated, that the women of the land would not have organized a revolt, declared a republic, elected a president, and marched down with banners flying to invest the capital and make their own terms with the terrified government of the day. No such Amazonian action was, happily, rendered necessary by sins of omission or commission on the part of their liege lords or legal protectors. That they had sufficient courage and martial spirit for such an émeute, no one doubted. But with the exception of a quasi-warlike observation by a Tasmanian girl, on beholding the phalanx of alien beauty arrayed at the naval ball, that on the next occasion of the sword she intended to bring her gun and shoot a girl or two from across the straits, by way of warning, no specific action was taken. So the old antagonism, veiled of course and conventional, that has existed between the home-grown and the imported feminine product, was conducted with discreet diplomacy, and the admirers of Helen and or Briseis had to content themselves with displaying personal or conversational superiority in lieu of lethal weapons. So, on the ground in drags, mail phaetons, buggies and dog-carts of the period, the female contingent arrived, chiefly before the first gun of the engagement metaphorically aroused the echoes in the glens and forest glades around Mount Wellington. The Hollywood Hall family was fully represented, the Claremonts, the Boyers, The magnate of Holmby, Mr. Dick Dereker, in all his glory, had deposited himself and his most intimate friend, John Hampden, a new arrival from England, at the club, and was daily to be viewed by the admiring population of Hobart, in Davy or Macquarie Street, in company with other stars of the social firmament. Mr. Blount noticed with interest the extraordinary popularity which encircled this favourite of fortune in the chief city of his native land. As he walked down the street, it was a kind of royal progress. He was the people's idol, the uncrowned king of the Happy Isle. Men of note and standing crossed over to greet and shake hands with him. Even the shady characters had a soft spot in their hardened hearts for Dickie Dereker. Why was this adulation? Other country gentlemen were handsome and chivalrous. All of them rode, drove, shot well. They, like him, had been born in the island, and as such had the claims of a patriot for suffrages of their countrymen. But the difficulty was to find all these virtues, personal recommendations, gifts and graces centred in one individual. The popular verdict so declared it, and if the classes and the masses in Tasmania had been polled as to his fitness for any post of eminence, from the vice-regal administrator of the government downward, every man, woman and child in the island would have gone solid for Dickie Dereker. Of this resistless, all-conquering sway, Mr. Blount was shortly to have proof and confirmation, had such been needed. Sooth to say, he felt more than slight misgivings, indeed something near to what is called an accusing conscience with respect to his marked attentions to and quasi-friendship for Laura Claremont on the occasion of his last visit to Hollywood Hall. He was then, it may be stated for the defence, in the somewhat perilous position of having been warned off, as he considered it, by the family at Maroondah, and was thus unprovided with an attraction of counterbalancing interest. Full many a heart is caught on the rebound, and doubtless the sympathetic manner and intellectual superiority of Laura Claremont, combined with her personal endowments, constituted a strong case for the unattached, unprotected stranger. When he returned to Tasmania, bringing his bride with him radiant with the overflowing happiness of the recent honeymoon, would the sympathetic friend in whose society he had so openly delighted look coldly upon him? Would her friends and compatriots combine to denounce him as an unworthy trifler, who, after paying compromising attentions, not only rode away, but married a former flame, not even permitting a decent interval to lapse between his preference for the old love and desertion of the new? Much troubled by these considerations, he had even thought over an indirect way of breaking the news in a non-committal way to the young lady and her perhaps justly incensed family and friends, but quis excuse s'accuse recurred to his mind with painful promptitude. So, fortunately, as it turned out, he decided to trust to time and chance for extrication from the dilemma, for as he was entering the hospitable portal of the Tasmanian Club, with a view to luncheon and the later news items, he was joined by Claude Clinton, who at once questioned him as to subscriptions for the forthcoming ball, given by the members and players of the Polo Club. "How many tickets shall I send you?" "They're a guinea for men and half as much for ladies." "And have you heard the last engagement?" "No." "It was only given out this morning. Laura Claremont has made up her mind at last. Dick Dereker is the happy man." "Send me a dozen tickets," said Mr. Blount, who felt like John Bunyan after his burden of sins had been removed. "They have my heartiest congratulations." "All right," said the omnipotent Secretary for Home Affairs. By the way, wasn't the fair Laura rather a friend of yours? The Tenby girls thought you were making strong running at the Hollywood ball." "Every man of sense and taste must admire Miss Claremont," he replied with diplomatic gravity, masking, however, emotions of such intensity that he had some difficulty in preserving calmness. "I was no exception to the rule, that was all." "Perhaps it helped to bring Master Dick to the scratch. The affair has been going on for years. If so, you did her a service. Dick is a splendid fellow, but when a man has a whole island to pick from, he feels inclined to dally with a decision. However, they are to be married at once, before the House meets, not to let the honeymoon interfere with his legislative duties." "I am delighted to hear it," Mr. Blount affirmed, with such evident sincerity that Mr. Clinton departed to overtake his multifarious duties, with the conviction that he was a fine, large-hearted, generous personage, as well in the matter of the ball subscriptions as in the more romantic passages of life's mystery. The young lady referred to had not come down to the naval ball for reasons of her own, or otherwise the squire's health requiring her attendance upon him at the Hall. Such, at any rate, was the explanation given by the family friends. Dear Laura was so attached to her father, and so self-denying and conscientious in the discharge of her duties. Some of the frivolous division, perhaps a trifle impatient of perpetual proclamation of Aristides the Just, hinted that there is such a device known to the female heart, inscrutable as are its myriad emotions and minor tendencies, as the encouragement of a fervent admirer up to a certain point, for the stimulation of a laggard lover, the adorer number 2 being known in the unstudied phase as the runner-up. However that may have been, Mr. Blount took care to communicate the momentous intelligence of his wife and sister-in-law immediately upon his arrival at home. Mrs. Blount, with natural curiosity, expressed a wish to see this wonderful Laura Claremont, whom everybody praised and indeed referred to as one of the few girls in the island worthy of Dick Dereker. "I suspect you flirted with her on that driving tour, and at the ball too. You lost your card, I remember. Now confess." "She is a very fine girl, dark and stately looking. Every one admires her, but as for comparing her, etc., the idea is preposterous." "He hadn't got our letters then, poor fellow," said Imogen, who fortunately was not of a jealous disposition. "So, if he made ever such a little swerve for what is called the path of duty, I suppose I must forgive him. He won't do so again, sir. I'll see to that. I hope you and Miss Claremont will be great friends. She's just the sort of woman you would like. I'll make a point of introducing you at the polo ball. Here are the tickets, and a few to spare." "You have been most generous," said Mrs. Bruce. "I'll keep 3 for Edward, myself, and a friend, if one turns up. I dare say we shall find 1 or 2. "No, take half. I bought them for the family. Perhaps some of the upper stirred people may turn up." "Quite likely," said Imogen. "Perhaps even from Bunjil. Oh dear, what fun that would be!" "I know what you're laughing at," said her sister. "Do you see her joke, Val?" "Not in the least. Let us share it, Mrs. Bruce." "It is a good joke," said the merry matron, going off again into fits of laughter, "but I shall not tell you just yet. It is a secret." The male relative looked puzzled, admitting that the solution was beyond him, at which stage it seemed destined to remain. End of Chapter 10, Part 2. Recording by Simona Rusu.
Section 17 of the Ghost Camp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ghost Camp by Rolf BOLDREWOOD. Chapter 11. A description of "the season" in Hobart, whether regarded as a summer land for tourists, a safe run ashore for the men and officers of the South Pacific Fleet in being detailed at Hobart, or as an object lesson for untravelled inhabitants, would seem to consist mainly of a record of recreational events, a list of picnics and pleasure parties, driving and fishing excursions with pedestrian rambles, chiefly by day, but occasionally au clair de la lune. The rivers named after Messrs. Brown and Huon, long dead celebrities, received more than their share of patronage, it would seem, in the entertainment of reckless revellers, whose polo meets and gymkhanas alternated with the legitimate annual races and steeplechases. There must have been business transactions, but they were eluded or postponed, the only exception being the great silver bonanza which kept its bond slaves hard at work, by means of remuneration on the higher scale. Night and day work proceeded with the regularity of one of its own steam engines. The Hobart weather was delightful, occasionally threatening rain, but chiefly relenting and ending towards the close of day with soft and cooling sea breezes, which refreshed the pleasure-driven crowds to the inmost fibre of the nervous system. In all these ingenious projects for lessening the strain upon the minds and bodies of ordinary humanity, the officers and men of H.M. Royal Navy were conspicuously effective. At all aristocratic entertainments, man-of-war Jack was utilized to keep the gangways clear, to hold the rope of division in the ballroom, and otherwise, as the handy man, in spotless array, to display his disciplined alertness. Even the naval church parade was attended by the fair ones of perhaps the last night's entertainment. On each Sunday morning, therefore, boatloads of worshippers in silk or muslin might be descried crossing the waters of the harbour, rowed by an ample crew under the charge of an all-important middy, to the flagship or frigate, where divine service was celebrated by the chaplain of the fleet, or other amphibious clergymen provided by the Lords of Admiralty. In this sense, perhaps, the gay season of Hobart constituted a social federation of the Australasian states, when other matters, not of ephemeral weight, might be suitably discussed. From the wave-beaten isles of New Zealand, where the mountain-crested billows rolled on their stormy march from the ice-fields of the ultimate pole, to the mangrove-bordered marshes of northern Queensland, from the Never Never country and the back blocks, from the Gulf and the buffalo lands of Essington and Darwin, came languid, fever-stricken squatters to breathe the cool air of this southern lotus land, differing among themselves in minor respects as to manner, accent, stature, and ordinary habitude, but in heart and brain British to the core. Roving sons of the great motherland, holding God's commission of the strong hand, the steadfast brain, to occupy the waste places of the earth and develop their inborn trend towards justice and mercy, law and order. With such inherited gifts going forth conquering and to conquer, to weld into one solid, enduring fabric the Empire of Britain. Thus, handing down to their children's children lands of freedom, broad-based upon the people's will, where equal laws administered with moderation and mercy are to be the heritage of England's sons, the Greater Britons of the South, for all time, and whether in peace or war, loyal, self-contained, immovable, one, and indivisible. The great event of the season was to be the polo ball, looked forward to with almost feverish eagerness, not only by the young men and maidens of the Happy Isle, but by the large important contingents from abroad, which exceeded in number and social value those of any previous year. Hence applications for tickets were beyond all calculation. Requests, even entreaties, poured in, almost until the opening of the doors of the great hall secured for the function. Claude Clinton was, as he said, walked off his legs, having indeed hardly time to dress and eat his dinner, while the committee, who had the onerous and responsible task of deciding upon the fitness of applicants, had to improvise a late sitting, so as not to disappoint the arrivals by train from Launceston, just landed from the New Zealand Company's extra service boat, the Rotorua. The funds of the club, however, would be benefited to such an extent that the secretary and committee worked loyally to the last moment, and when Mr. Clinton had given a last authoritative order and made a final inspection of the decorations, he sat down to his dinner at the Travellers' Club, and drank his pint of champagne with a conviction that everything had been done to deserve success, and that the issue lay with fate. Imogen had condescended to inform her relations that a friend of hers had arrived from Melbourne, who, having made up her mind at the last moment, would dress and join their party after dining at the Orient Hotel, where rooms had been secured for her previously. She had written confidentially to Mr. Clinton and had her name properly submitted to and passed by the committee. All was arranged, and she would go under Imogen's chaperonage to the ball, and perhaps stay with them all night. "What is her name? Do I know her, Imogen?" inquired her husband. "You are very mysterious, my dear." "You have seen her, she tells me, but I am not certain whether you will recognize her. She comes from some place near Adelong in New South Wales. Her people used to live in Tumut." "Then the probability is that she will be good-looking," said Mr. Blount. "Some of the handsomest girls I ever saw came from that sequestered spot. However, we must wait till she shows up. Was she a schoolfellow of yours?" "No, not exactly, but I knew her when she was younger. You will know all about her when the time comes. I feel desperately hungry after this exciting day. Oh, I hear the dinner gong." The dinner was not unduly prolonged, as any one of experience in the anxieties and precautions which precede such an important function will understand. So that after an adjournment to the drawing-room, when about 9 o'clock the maid delivered a message, sotto voce, to Mrs. Imogen, who forthwith left the room, every one resolved great expectations. These were chiefly realized when the hostess reappeared, accompanied by a tall, handsome, exceedingly well-dressed girl, who blushed and smiled as she was introduced to the company as Miss Maguire of Warrenbean. "Very pleased to meet you, Miss Maguire," began Blount, but with a sudden alteration of tone and manner. "Why, it's Sheila! By all the powers, what a transformation!" as Mrs. Bruce shook her warmly by the hand, while Imogen stood by her charge, apparently charmed with the metamorphosis which leisure, the use and reputation of money, had effected in the unformed country girl, so lately the maid of the inn at the secluded village of Bunjil on the Upper Sturt. "You didn't know me, Mr. Blount, I could see that. I had half a mind to ask you what you'd like for breakfast. I'm turned into a young lady nowadays, you see, and Mrs. Blount, in her great kindness, persuaded me to come to the ball tonight with her and Mrs. Bruce. I've been to the show ball at Wagga, and one or two in Tumut by way of a start, but this is such a grand affair, I feel frightened." "I am sure, Sheila, you have no cause to be," said Mrs. Bruce reassuringly. "You native girls can all dance, it seems an instinct, your dress is charming, and you will gather confidence as the ball goes on and your card is filled. You are a mysterious stranger for the present. That alone will be an attraction. We'll see to your introductions, and there are naval men in profusion." "I like sailors," said Sheila. "They are so unaffected and jolly, put on no side." She had been at a country ball at the age of 16, to which the officers of a man of war, then in Sydney, had been bidden by a liberal-minded squatter, who had invited the whole of the township inhabitants in one act, and a great success it was, for Sheila bore about with her all the time the memory of 2 polkas, a waltz, and a gallop danced with the Honourable Mr. de Bracy, midshipman of the period, to their mutual satisfaction and enjoyment. "I think you will have your share of partners, Sheila," said her hostess. "You certainly do credit to your dressmaker, and the Upper Sturt complexion will give you a chance with these Tasmanian girls, who are justly celebrated for theirs." "What a transformation!" said Blount to his wife, before they put on their wraps. "I never could have believed it. Of course she has fined down since the Bunjil days. I believe old Barney sold a Queensland station with 30,000 head of cattle just before the seasons turned dry, so she and her sister are considerable heiresses. She has, as you see, self-possession, and sense enough to avoid anything outré. You'll see, she'll get on quite well, make a success indeed. People say money isn't everything, but it goes a long way in this or any other country, especially combined with looks and other good qualities. You had better dance the opening set of Lancers with her for a start." Mrs. Imogen's predictions were verified. There was a certain amount of romantic interest attached to the fresh-looking, handsome stranger, reputed wealthy, and who danced so well. Came, too, people said, with that nice, high-bred-looking Mrs. Bruce and the bride. She danced the first Lancers with Mr. Blount, and while exhibiting familiarity with the figures, moved with the graceful indifference which has succeeded the erstwhile precision with which the steps were anciently performed. Mr. Blount managed to secure an early waltz, and the naval men coming by shiploads, as it appeared to her, Sheila's programme was filled in no time. That there could not have been a better ball, all the authorities combined to declare. The ever-successful secretary and plenipotentiary had once more covered himself with glory, the arrangements were perfect, the supper was a dream, and when Sheila found herself taken in by the captain of the flagship, the admiral, and the governor being in the immediate vicinity, she wondered whether she was likely to fall down in a fit, or if some other kind of death would result from such an overflowing flood of triumphant, ecstatic bliss. However, she did not die, or indeed was she likely to perish of nervous excitement consequent on pure unadulterated pleasure. The early bush training, together with a naturally good constitution, would always preserve her from such an untimely fate. Imogen was carefully, prudently introduced to Miss Laura Claremont, who prophesied that they would be great friends, and invited her and her sister to Hollywood. both of which Imogen accepted conditionally on her husband's (she laid a slight emphasis on that very possessive word) on her husband's not being hurried away by Mr. Frampton to that horrid Zeehan. The Upper Sturt party, as we may for convenience describe them, got their full share of partners, it may be believed, being all of the age when, if there be an ear for music, and a terpsichorean taste, what time the raving polka spins adown the rocking floor, with good music, suitable partners, and a smooth surface, nothing much better among the lighter enjoyments of life is to be found. With Miss Claremont, Blount had danced before, when their steps appeared to suit extremely well. On this occasion he saw no reason why he should deny himself the fleeting indulgence of once more gliding and sliding about with her in the accepted fashion. She graciously acceded to his request for an after-supper dance, and in one of the partly deserted side rooms they came to a mutual understanding which each felt was more or less needed. "I owe you a few words," she said, "if our friendship is to continue, and I should be sorry for it to end abruptly. It appears to me that we were both in an exceptional state of mind when we met at Hollywood for the first time, and if something had not happened, which did happen, one of us would have felt a right to blame the other." "You have stated the position most fairly," he said. "I hope you don't think I am so logical," she replied, "as to be deficient in feeling. Believe me when I tell you," and here her dark eyes glowed with a transient gleam of hidden fire which he had never before noticed in them, "I don't exaggerate when I say that it was a fateful crisis, such as I had never before experienced." "It was most truly a supreme moment in my destiny," he replied, as she faltered and then stopped, overcome by emotion. "But let me go on, I entreat, to make an open and full confession, for I can never recur to the subject, and I trust you to make a similar promise." "It is given," said Blount in all sincerity. "Then," said Miss Claremont, "I will not deny that I was attracted to you at our first meeting, more, perhaps, than towards any man whom I had ever met, with one exception. You were different from any one with whom I had previously come into contact. This impression was confirmed as we saw more of each other. I recognized your mental qualities. I approved highly of your opinions, your personal attributes and general character appealed to me strongly. My heart was in an unsettled state. I was weary of waiting, and began to doubt whether Richard Dereker, with whom I had been in love ever since I could remember, intended to declare himself. I am not believed to be impulsive, but under certain conditions am very much so." "All women are," interjected Blount. "Possibly. But let me finish," and she hurried on, her voice changed from the deliberate calmness with which she usually spoke to a hurried monotone. "If you had proposed to me that night, I should have consented, I believe. But your departure next morning gave me time to reflect, saved me, most likely both of us, from lifelong incompleteness, which, to a woman at least, means settled unhappiness. Then just after you left, my fairy prince made up his mind, as people say, and I am the happiest girl in Tasmania. I need not ask about your feeling, it is written in large print over both of you, and here she comes. I don't wonder." "I was in a most forlorn and wretched state," said Blount, "when you took pity on me and healed my wounds by your sympathetic kindness. Never think you could have done me an injury, and you must let me say, even under our changed conditions, that I should not have been a lifelong sufferer. But as in your case, the fairy princess was persuaded of her knight's fidelity. The falsehoods set about by enemies were disproved, and the castle rang with troubadour ballads and the usual merry-making, when the traitors and faitors were put into their proper places, and so the incident is closed, and in all gratitude and enduring friendship it is a case of 'as you were.'" "Yes, I know, said the fair Laura. "No more protestations, or else your wife will require explanations too. Who is the very handsome damsel she has with her?" "Well, a great friend of mine, who stood by me staunchly in my tribulations and rendered me timely aid. She is a New South Wales heiress. I will tell you about her another time." "We have been looking for you, Miss Claremont," said Imogen. "I was anxious to introduce my friend Miss Maguire, a friend of my husband's too, who did him important service at a critical juncture, without which, between you and me, things might have turned out differently." "Mr. Blount gave me to understand as much," said Miss Claremont, "and I am most happy to welcome any friend of yours or his to our island home." "I hope you have enjoyed yourself, Miss Maguire." "More than I ever did in my life before," said Sheila, with such evident sincerity that no one could help smiling. "I think the people here are the kindest and pleasantest I ever met. I have often heard of Hobart hospitality, but never expected to find it anything like this. I hope we shall continue to deserve such a good character. Strangers do generally approve of us, and there is no doubt we are always delighted to see them. I suppose we ought to make a move, Mrs. Blount. I see Richard looking out anxiously for me. We must all go and thank Claude Clinton, if he isn't dead with fatigue. We owe a great deal to him." "That we do," said Sheila naively. "He told me he had been hard at work since daylight arranging thousands of things. Poor fellow! I quite pitied him. I was nearly offering to help with the supper. I am supposed to be clever in that line. You might have come off as well as the girl who volunteered to take the parlour maid's place when her sister was short of one at a big dinner, and afterwards married a baronet with 10,000 a year, who thought she said, 'Sherry, sir,' so nicely." "I see Claude Clinton over there," interposed Blount, who thought the situation was becoming critical. "He'll be fast asleep if we don't go and pelt him with congratulations. Say something nice to him, Sheila." "That I will," said she with effusion. "I quite love him for his kind-heartedness." "You're not the only grateful one," said Miss Claremont, "but you'll have to wait your turn. Dick must make a speech, and we'll all say amen." "I'll do anything if you'll come home," said that gentleman. "You girls would stay till daylight, I believe. Claude, my boy, come here and be publicly thanked. These ladies have constituted themselves a deputation, and wish to assure you that this is the best ball they ever were at in their lives, that it wouldn't have been half as good but for you, that they will be everlastingly grateful for the perfect arrangements you have made. Miss Maguire can't express her feelings in words, but is most anxious to—" "Oh, Mr. Dereker," cried Sheila, blushing to the roots of her hair, "pray don't. Oh, don't interrupt. She's most anxious to say amen." "Amen," said Sheila gravely, and evidently much relieved. "For what we have received, etc., etc.," continued Mr. Dereker. "Now for shawls and the carriage. Can we set you down at the club, Claude, and you can make a suitable reply on the way?" Possibly he did, as he was wedged in close to Sheila, and what he had to say was in a softly murmurous tone, akin to that of the surges on the shore, which the silence of the summer night made clearly audible. After the triumphant success of the ball, other entertainments followed in quick succession, in which the visitors, civil, naval, and military, vied with each other in keeping up the excitement, so that the season of 1800 was long known as the most successful, harmonious, and generally mirthful period recorded in Tasmanian annals. Races, regattas, picnics, gymkhanas, were in turn attended by crowds of visitors from all the colonies. Of four-in-hand drags there was quite a procession. Agriculture was prospering, stock was high in price and quality, mining operations and investments not only in this, but in all the other colonies, were phenomenally payable. The financial glow shed by the ever-increasing, almost fabulous yield of the Comstock, and of the great copper and tin mines, Mount Lyell and Mount Bischoff, gave a magical lustre to all monetary transactions. A kind of Arabian Nights glamour was cast over the existence of the dwellers in the land, and of all the excited crowds who had hurried to the favourite isle, where Aladdin's cave seemed suddenly to have opened its treasure chambers in real life and in broad day, to the favourite inhabitants of the far south isle. Foremost among the gay throngs who seemed bent upon taking fullest advantage of the revelries of the period, so appropriate, so suitable, so thoroughly in harmony with the spirit of the hour, were the festive celebrities of the Victorian party, by which name they began to be known. Mr. Blount had no notion of receiving all the benefits of his newly acquired possessions without doing something in requital. His liberality was unbounded. He subscribed generously to all charitable societies and local institutions. He gave picnics, dances, and fishing parties. He even went the length of chartering a steamer and carrying off a large fashionable party to the weird, gloomy solitudes of Macquarie Harbour. Here the frolic-minded crowd found their spirits lowered, and their imagination darkly disturbed, as they roamed amid the ruinous prison-houses, where rotting timbers told the tale of long neglect, of fast-fading memories of crime and suffering. They gazed on the immense tenantless buildings with hundreds of cubicles, the mouldering walls, roofless and ivy-grown, The church where it was deemed that the wretches whose lives were one long foretaste of hell might be turned to hopes of heaven after completing a life of imprisonment, torture, and despair. Vehicles were in attendance besides saddle horses and guides, under whose safe conduct the revellers made their way to the silent, deserted settlement, whence long ago the ghastly procession of chained men marched at morn to commence each day, a day in which they cursed their birth hour at dawn and eve, ending it by trusting that each night might be their last. The visitors trod the rotting planks of the stage, where fierce dogs had bayed and torn at their chains as they scented the escaping convict, where more than one such desperate felon had been literally torn in pieces, or escaped the hounds to die a more terrible death amid the sharks which swarmed around the pier. These and other relics of the bad old days of mystery and fear having been shudderingly regarded by the awed and whispering company, the Albatross departed with a fair wind, a smooth sea, and her much relieved visitors, who, ignorant of man's cruelty, marvelled such relics here should be. Yet as the stars came out and sat upon thrones, looking with sleepless eyes upon the shadowy outlines of the darksome forest and the savage coast, a wailing night wind arose, sounding as a ghostly accompaniment to the dirge-like murmur of the great army of the dead, buried and unburied, around the accursed charnel houses which had polluted even the Dantean wilderness. "Oh, let us get away from this dreadful place," said Imogen, clinging to her husband's arm, "and I vote against seeing any other chamber of horrors. We come to Hobart for rest and pleasure while this halcyon season lasts. Let us not sadden our souls by one thought of the terrors in which this place is steeped. I should like to blot out their very memory and consume the relics off the face of the earth. It must not be considered either that the truce of God, as cessation of siege or battle was medievally termed, which the Happy Isle proclaimed to the war-worn denizens of other colonies, less happily situated for rest and recreation, was entirely devoted to play. This year was the session wisely ordained as fitted in with the general vacation for the meeting of the Society for the Advancement of Science. Hither came, therefore, to leaven the ordinary frivolities, learned professors from Australasian universities, legal luminaries, judges, the Q.C. and the rising barrister, mercantile magnates, statisticians of world-wide fame, even, indeed, Sir Gregory Gifford, also Sir Harold Harfager, an ex-proconsul of our Indian Empire. They were vice-regal guests, minor luminaries, such as authors, war correspondents, politicians, homegrown and foreign. In fact, almost all the men of light and leading were represented at this unique gathering. Missionaries from far Pacific Isles who had faced cannibal hordes and heard the yell from crowded war canoes when poisoned arrows were in the air. They had their philological treasures and hard-won trophies to exhibit. The crowded lecture rooms testified to the interest taken in the soldiers of the Army of Peace. To add to the satisfaction with which the various excitements and entertainments were availed of by the party from the Upper Sturt, it so chanced that in consequence of the favourable seasons, Edward Bruce was enabled to join them a month earlier than he had expected. He was, moreover, in excellent spirits, openly avowing his intention to devote his stay in Hobart to pleasure unalloyed, as compensation for his late pastoral anxieties. He was not contented, however, after a fortnight's idleness, without organising a trip to the mine, which had lately so developed in wealth, prestige, and reputation, that it was difficult to say whether it belonged to Tasmania or Tasmania belonged to it. Everything and everybody appeared to be in a state of unprecedented prosperity in that happy and carefree annus mirabilis, if ever there was one. Mrs. Bruce and Imogen mildly reproached Bruce for being in such a hurry to leave his family after so long an absence, and what was worse, carrying off Imogen's husband. However, he, a man of unresting energy and enterprise, declared that he could not stand any more of this lotus-eating life, and that if he did not get away out to the mine, he would have to return to Miranda. At this dreadful threat Mrs. Bruce capitulated, fearing a premature departure from this land of utopian delights, where the children were improving so fast and gaining a reserve of vigour impossible in a hotter climate. This consideration in the devoted mother's eyes overbore all others, and caused her to look philosophically upon the proposed expedition, which was accordingly decided upon, and a day fixed for the start, the which came off without accident or delay. It may be doubted whether, except in theatrical stage life, anything surpasses in rapidity of transformation The change from a fragment of the primeval wilderness into a thickly populated town founded on a gold or silver field of proved richness. Macadamized streets and level footpaths take the place of miry dray tracks and sloughs of despond. So was it in the city of Comstock. Handsome hotels and shop fronts with plate glass windows had succeeded weatherboard and slab shanties with bark roofs. The electric lighting globe and street lamps shed its searching radiance through the main thoroughfare and alley. The diurnal coach by which our travellers arrived was well horsed and punctual to a fault. The police magistrate and warden of Goldfields, assisted by a strong body of police, preserved order and punished evildoers with such deterrent strictness that offences against the law were almost unknown. A municipality with mayor, councillors, and aldermen had been formed after the British pattern. Thus the foundations of earliest English law had been laid, and as the erstwhile barren, hopeless lodge in the wilderness increased in wealth and population, so the state, broad-based upon the people's will, emerged ready-made, only awaiting that gradual development which comes instinctively in Anglo-Saxon communities, to pass from the rude stage of the mining camp to the perfected organization of the city. It was soon made apparent to the party that Hobart was not the only place where public entertainments and festive gatherings were to be found. The mayor and corporation of Comstock, waiting upon the distinguished visitors, whose arrival was duly chronicled in the Clarion, invited them to a formal banquet where champagne and profusion was exhibited, and the health of their guests proposed by the mayor, Mr. Frampton Tregonwell, who made honourable mention of that distinguished pastoralist and explorer, Mr. Edward Hampton Bruce. Before this function they had been taken to the lower levels of the mine, when the drives being lighted up and a few judiciously selected masses of native silver and malachite looked up for the occasion, Mr. Bruce formed the opinion that he stood in a quarry of one of the chief precious metals. Being a man of business habits as well as of pastoral experience, he took the opportunity, under Mr. Tregonwell's authority, to inspect the accounts of the company, and after examining the astonishing values of crude and treated ore, he came to the conclusion that his sister-in-law, untoward as had been the early stages of their acquaintance, had displayed the unerring instinct with which her sex is credited, in her venture in the matrimonial lottery. The audit demonstrated the cheering fact that an income of from $10,000 to $20,000 a year was assured to each of the 4 original shareholders in this most fortunate enterprise. "I suppose you and Imogen will be taking a trip home in a few months," he said. "With all this money and the prospects of the season in London, Australia will lose some of its interest. Such is our intention, unless anything unforeseen comes in the way after the Hobart season has come to an end and you good folks have wended your way back to the Upper Sturt. I think of taking our passage by the first P&O steamer from Sydney. Won't it be rather cold to arrive in England so early in the year? We propose to stay a month or 2 in Cairo on the way, refreshing our memories of the Arabian Nights, transshipping by the Brindisi route, and after a week or 2 in Paris, reaching London in May in time for Imogen to hear her first nightingale. A very sensible programme. I wish we were going with you. However, later on, if the seasons and the stock keep up, we may come and stay at your country seat. It was the most fortunate day of my life when I stayed at yours, though appearances were against me, I confess. However, I look forward to seeing you and Hilda in my native county, which is not wholly without interest, especially in shooting, hunting, and fishing. However, I think it's drawing on to feeding time. Champagne goes better after subterranean experiences than before." The banquet was a success. Blount found himself referred to not only as the original capitalist in the formation of the great mineral property, which had advanced Tasmania by half a century socially, commercially, and mineralogically, the last word a trifle slurred, but as a patron of the fine arts, a generous supporter of local charities, and a citizen of whom they would all be proud, and would remember gratefully in days to come. They trusted that even in the splendid pageantry of the old and venerated society in which he and his amiable wife were so soon to share, the humble but heartfelt hospitality of the tight little island called Tasmania would not be wholly forgotten. Their honoured guests had accepted invitations to be present at a ball to be given that evening for the purpose of supplementing the funds of the local hospital, and all hoped to meet them there. They knew that there were several representative institutions, including the library, of which they were justly proud, to inspect. They would not detain the guest by making further remarks. Mr. Blount had no hesitation in saying that he was never more genuinely surprised than by witnessing the astonishing, he might say unparalleled, progress made by the town and district since his last visit. In the formation of the streets, in the water service, in the installation of electric lighting, in the hospital and library, Comstock was ahead of many old established country towns in Britain. Personally, he should always take a deep interest in the municipal as well as the material progress of the city, and feel genuine pride in having contributed to its inception and development. A general inspection of the local institutions filled up the afternoon. The free library attracted much attention. It had been commenced by subscription and with private donations, supplemented by books from tourists and visitors, who generally left any they brought to read by the train or steamer on the journey up. It was a heterogeneous collection, ranging from very light fiction to works on metallurgy, theology, and civil engineering. However, there was no lack of works of solid value, so that the miner who wished to improve or distract his mind had no difficulty in finding books to suit his taste. At the hospital, apart from typhoid fever and dysentery patients, the cases were mostly fractures and other injuries resulting from mining accidents. This establishment, as at all gold and silver fields, was most liberally supported, irrespective of race, creed, or color. No working miner knew whose turn it might be the next to be carried there in agony or insensibility. Many were the gifts, unostentatiously bestowed by former patients, in the shape of necessaries or luxuries for convalescence. These duty visits performed, dinner was undertaken at the Palace Hotel, a stately three-storied building with a veranda nearly 20 feet wide and balconies to match. After a more or less sumptuous repast in the salle à manger, electric lighted, where they were served by well-dressed waiters with wines of undoubted excellence, and a menu almost extravagant in variety, but sparingly partaken of, Messrs. Bruce, Blount, and Tregonwell sallied forth accompanied by a dozen dignitaries to the town hall. In this imposing building a crowd of dancers in plain or fancy dress were already in the full swing of pleasurable excitement. End of Chapter 11. Recording by Philip Gould. Chapter 12 of The Ghost Camp. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ghost Camp by Rolf BOLDREWOOD. Chapter 12. A gold or silver field of decent rank and reputation must always compare favorably in its amusements with a town. In the wide range of his experiences, in war and peace, on land and water, British or foreign, the roving miner may challenge comparison with all sorts and conditions of men. Thus he is never at a loss for a character to represent, a costume in which to disguise, or to heighten his personal attractions. The same rule applies to the women of the family, who have followed his wanderings, sharing in his privations or triumphs as the case may be. Bearing with exemplary patience the inevitable hardships, they are none the less eager to recoup themselves when legitimate opportunities arise for amusement. When Messrs. Bruce, Blount, and other magnates arrived on the scene, they were accommodated with seats on the dais, where they sat proudly in full public view, reflecting how sharply contrasted was the scene before them with any possible gathering on the site of the Comstock claim of 4 men's ground, little more than a year ago. The great hall, 70 feet in length by 30 in width, was brilliantly lighted, draped with flags of all nations, above which, surmounting the dais, the Union Jack reigned supreme. Upon the satin-like Huon pine floor strode a motley crowd, pirates and princes, peasants and brigands, ballerinas and matadors, mingled with dairymaids and broom-girls, flower-sellers and fishwives, whose "Caller herring" had the smack of the well-remembered cry, while dowagers and duchesses, grisettes, tricoteuses, shepherds and sundowners jostled here and there in the dance with a red Indian, a cowboy, or even an aboriginal in his blanket. The distinguished visitors, so described in the morning's Clarion, paid due respect to their municipal and other entertainers. They stood high in the estimation of their partners, whose looks and enthusiasm for the dance they would have been indeed hypocritical to have criticized. Charlie Herbert and Jack Clark, the latter having got rid of his unfortunate lameness, were habited as a bushranger and a stockrider respectively. They remained till supper was over, during which exceedingly festive refection Mr. Blount's health, as a fearless explorer, was enthusiastically toasted, while Mr. Tregonwell was referred to as a world-renowned mining captain and the father of the field. Charlie Herbert was eulogized as a worthy son of the soil, who, like Mr. Dereker, the speaker must say Dick Dereker, cheers, was an honor to his native land, and like him destined to make a name in the great world. Here everyone rose and cheered to the echo. The speeches in requital of this courtesy were brief but pointed, and long before the conclusion of the function Messrs. Bruce and Blount quietly departed, and soon after sunrise were on the way back to Hobart, accompanied by Charlie Herbert and Clark, who deemed themselves to have a just claim to exceptional recreation after their pioneer experiences. Moreover, they explained that they could afford to enjoy themselves with a clear conscience, while Mr. Tregonwell remained on guard, a man never known to sleep on his post. So these young men chartered a 4-in-hand drag a few miles out of Hobart, and having borrowed a coach horn, entered that city with all proper pomp and circumstance. When Charlie Herbert proceeded to swing his reefing leaders and pull up at the General Post Office, quite a crowd had assembled, eager to gaze on and to welcome the prospectors of the wondrous Comstock mine. After depositing themselves and their belongings at the Tasmanian Club, the junior shareholders stated with decision that, having had a fair allowance of hard work and hard living, they were now going to enjoy themselves, also to make some return for the hospitality they had enjoyed in former years. As pleasant detrimentals, though suspiciously regarded by cautious matrons, they had always, on the whole, been popular, their want of capital being overlooked in favour of their engaging manners and family connections. Now, as original shareholders in the great mining property of the day, they were princes, paladins, long-lost brothers, in fact, most desirable and distinguished. Everybody from the Supreme Court judges downward called on and made much of them. Without them no party was complete. At the polo meets they were conspicuous. They rode splendidly, everyone said, as indeed they did. But not having been able to keep ponies in former years, this was their first opportunity of exhibiting that accomplishment in public. Of course they were not long in letting people know that they wanted to give their friends, and more particularly the ladies of Hobart, some kind of entertainment. The question now being of what pattern and dimensions it should consist. To this end grave consultations were held. Of balls and parties there had been nearly enough. The young people were, strange to say, beginning to be tired of dancing. Laura Claremont talked of going home to Hollywood soon, if not earlier, certainly next week. Mr. Bruce was becoming impatient. He began to think about mustering those polled Angus bullocks in the river paddocks for the Melbourne market, when a chance remark by Mrs. Blount settled the matter and decided the character of the entertainment. "How would it be to have a picnic party to the Hermitage?" she inquired, with an air of much innocence and simplicity. "There is a lovely road by Brown's River, and such a view. No one is at the bungalow now but a caretaker. There is one fine large room and a grand veranda looking out to sea. The eatables, etc., could be arranged early in the day, and if we were a little late coming home, the nights are so lovely. We can have all the men of war people, and just in time, too. I heard they were to be off to the islands soon." "Magnificent!" cried out Charlie Herbert and Jack Clark in one breath. "Mrs. Blount, you have saved our lives. Jack and I were getting quite low-spirited and suicidal. We could think of nothing worth while. Balls are played out. The races at Elwick were about the last excitement. A picnic on a vast and comprehensive scale is the very thing. Miss Maguire, when does the Admiral give the order for Nukuava?" Sheila blushed and seemed taken aback, but rallying answered, "The Captain Bold does not confide in any foremast hand, Matilda. Isn't that in one of the Bab ballads?" "Oh, I thought Vernon Harcourt might have told you," said Charlie. "You and he seemed so confidential the other evening." "Suppose you ask him yourself, Mr. Herbert. But at any rate it won't be till the week after next." Here everybody laughed, and the girl, seeing that she had given herself away, looked confused. "Tell him not to be rude, Sheila. What business is it of his? Say you won't go to his picnic, and then it will be a dismal failure." Mrs. Blount stood alongside her protégé and looked threateningly at Master Charlie, who pretended to be shocked at his faux pas. and went down on one knee to Sheila to implore forgiveness. "I've a great mind to box your ears, Mr. Herbert," she said, as her face lighted up with a smile of genuine mirth, "but I suppose I must forgive you this time. Now what about this picnic? That's the real question, and where is it to be?" "I vote for the Hermitage," said Imogen. "Don't you, Hilda? I drove you there one day with Matchless." "A lovely spot," said Mrs. Bruce, "only I was afraid the mare would jump over the cliff once. The road is lovely. I feel sure all the world will come. We must have half a dozen four in hands. Imogen and I will be chaperones. I suppose you young men can forage up 2 more?" "Miss Claremont," suggested Jack Clark. "She is so nice." "Quite agree with you," said Imogen, "but she is not married yet. Suppose you ask Mrs. Wendover of the chalet. She is so kind, and at the same time capable of keeping order, which is necessary, Mr. Herbert, isn't it?" "Now don't be severe, Mrs. Blount. All you young married women get so dreadfully proper, and talk alarmingly about your husbands. I'll find security for good behaviour." "Only my fun," said Imogen. "But I'm afraid you've hurt Sheila's feelings. Has she forgiven you?" "Oh, Mrs. Blount, don't tease him any more," cried Sheila. "He looks really sorry. It was all my fault for taking his chaff seriously." "What do you think of Lady Wood?" said Mrs. Bruce, "from West Australia?" "The very one," cried out all the council. "She has a habit of authority as the wife of the Premier of the Golden West Colony, and though this is a silver mine, chez vous, the relationship is obvious." This interpolation was Mr. Jack Clark's. "Those who are in favour, hold up your hands. Against it, nobody. The resolution is carried." "Now for ways and means," said Charles Herbert. "First of all, the 4-in-hand drags. There mustn't be fewer than half a dozen, with power to add to their number. The men, too, must be able to drive. Claude Clinton and I will see to that. Of course we make him an honorary member of the Committee of Management. The affair wouldn't be complete without him." "Of course not." Chorus. "For he's," etc., etc. "Isn't it rather early for a song?" queried Mrs. Bruce. "Not at all, when 2 such voices as yours and Mrs. Blount's are available, and this is such a grand room to sing in. Music after breakfast, when you've nothing to do afterwards, is simply delicious." "Well, only 1 verse. Sheila and I will join in," said Mrs. Bruce. "If Edward comes in, he'll think we're going out of our minds." The tribute to Mr. Clinton's merits having been rendered with feeling, Sheila's fresh voice holding a good position, the council went on to strict business. "The drags first," said Mr. Herbert. "The affair must be started properly. Now, who are there?" "There's Gerald Branksome, from W.A. He can drive, I know. He won the tandem race at the Polo Gymkhana, and the Victoria Cross race at Hurlingham last year. He can be guaranteed. There's Jim Allinson, just down from Sydney, a well-known whip. I've seen him drive to Randwick from the Union Club. The Cornhall drag, with its 4 greys, will take some beating. I wired to Dick Derricker. He'll turn up. Jack, are you good for the break with that off leg of yours? It's a responsible position." "Count me in," said that gentleman, who had been to San Francisco. "Joe Bowman will help with the brake business." "That's good enough," said Herbert. "Joe will keep an eye on you going downhill. I'll have one if I have to wire to Melbourne for a team. That makes the half dozen, doesn't it? I dare say there'll be another or 2 by and by. Buggies, tandem carts, and private carriages may be left to their own discretion or that of their owners. There'll be no lack of them, I dare say." Once the great event was decided upon, neither difficulties nor delays were considered worthy of notice. The date was fixed. The invitations were sent out next morning. The social status of the entertainment being exceptional, no one dreamed of refusing. Rumours of the scale of magnificence upon which it was to be carried out commenced to circulate, for one of the conditions of unparalleled advantage in such affairs, an unrestricted bank balance, was in this case notorious. Money being no object to these youthful Monte Cristos, they were able to indulge, therefore, all the fancies of generous dispositions with excited imaginations. No expense was spared, no thoughtful kindness omitted. A large proportion of the hackney carriages and other livery stable vehicles were secured. As at a contested election, they plied from the General Post Office to the Hermitage, with free transit for all holders of invitation cards. The arrangements were complete and successful beyond all previous holiday experiences. and when Charlie Herbert took the lead with an impressive team, and the Belle of Hobart on the box seat of his drag, life, it may be confidently stated, had few richer moments or more dazzling triumphs in store for him. If he did not, quote, "let fate do her worst," there could be no doubt that he felt deep down in his heart the delicious, ever new, ever fresh sentiment of the poet. Next in order came Edward Bruce, with Sheila on the box beside him, wild with joy and the excitement of such a position, of which, except in a dream fairy tale, she had never realized the possibility. Imogen, beside her, had insisted on relinquishing the place of honor. "No, Sheila, my dear, my fortune is told. Your turn has yet to come, and you have all our best wishes, you know." "You are too good, Miss Imogen, Mrs. Blount, I mean. Really, I don't know what I am saying." "Well, you're looking your best today, Sheila. Your dress couldn't be better, and this lovely day has sent all the roses to your cheeks. Why, you might pass for a Tasmanian girl, really, and we know what that means." "Now, you girls," said Edward Bruce, in accents of veiled command, "keep your eyes about you going down this hill. It's trying with a heavy load, and I've heard of accidents. Imogen, put your foot on the brake that side, and give me the least bit of help. Now we're on the level again. Isn't that view of the sea lovely?" Reginald Vernon Harcourt, R.N., Flag Lieutenant of H.M.S. Orlando, was understood to be of that opinion as he leaned forward from his seat in the body of the coach, immediately behind the two young women aforesaid, and remarked as much. This was not the only statement he made before the procession pulled up at the Sandy Bay Hotel at the base of the hill, immediately below the Hermitage. And it did not go unnoted that, being favourably situated for talking to Sheila over her right shoulder, he made prompt use of the position as a naval strategist of experience, while Imogen and Jack Clark, similarly situated, did not appear to be quite so eager for conversation. The enumeration of the drags and traps following would resemble that of the Greek ships at the siege of Troy. It will be sufficient to say that Mr. Dereker's grey team was held to be the best as to matching and style, Dick Dereker the most finished exponent of the coaching science, worthy of the great annual pageant in Hyde Park. There were a few dissentients who thought the Quorn Hall team and drag faultless, but the opposition votes were too powerful. He was Dick Dereker, therefore unapproachable in love, war, sport, and every other form of manly excellence. There was nothing more to be said. His name settled the matter. As it happened, nothing could possibly have been more deliciously perfect than the weather. Warm without oppressive heat or sultry feeling, the faint sea breeze, the murmuring lazy surge roll, completed the magic spell, which invited to sensuous enjoyment the happy possessors of unworn youth, in which class the greater proportions of the guests were fortunately included. The day, the season, the environment, and attendant circumstances being propitious, so was the gathering, which was beyond all precedent successful. All the four-in-hands had turned up. There was such a crowd at the General Post Office that traffic was temporarily impeded, but that did not matter in Hobart, as it certainly would have done in Melbourne or Sydney, where indignation would have been aroused. The Tasmanian population is kindly and forbearing, especially to the stranger within their gates, through whom in the season, it must be admitted, their revenues are substantially benefited. So as the four-in-hands passed in single file down Davy Street, cheers rent the air, and hearty popular enthusiasm was evoked. The hill below the Hermitage was long and steep, so it was arranged that the drags and carriages were to be left at the hotel, where adequate accommodation had been provided, as well for the horses as for the grooms and drivers to them appertaining. The walk uphill was neither long nor unduly fatiguing, providing also for reasonable deviations into the forest paths, whence more extended views might be enjoyed, or confidential communications exchanged. This arrangement seemed to suit the majority of the guests, who might, without loss of time, have been seen scattered over the sides and summit of the forest hill. At the sound of the great Chinese gong, a fragment of loot from the summer palace at Peking, in the half-forgotten Chinese War, a strong converging force prepared to invest the Hermitage. Here were seen tables on trestles in the principal room, laden with all the good things which a very active, well-paid caterer had been able to collect: haunches of venison, barons of beef, saddles of mutton, turkeys of great size and amplitude, wild fowl of all descriptions, lake trout, fresh salmon, frozen, grouse and pheasant, from the same miraculous arrangement, rendered the choice of viands difficult, and the taste of the most fastidious gourmet easy to satisfy. With the popping of the first champagne corks, the conversation began to strike the note of cheerfulness proper to the occasion, after which the crescendo was maintained at an uninterruptedly joyous, even vivacious level. Speeches were sternly deprecated. An immediate adjournment to the beach was proposed and promptly carried out. The shining sands invited to every kind of game and dance suitable to an open-air revel. Sets of lancers were formed. Games such as 2s and 3s, oranges and lemons, hide and seek, found enthusiastic supporters, while those pairs who had anything particular to say to each other found quiet paths and shady nooks in the forest fringe, which lay so conveniently close to the beaches and headlands. There was, apparently, no lack of mutual entertainment or necessity for the givers of the feast to invent fresh frolics, for just as the low sun gave warning and the last game of rounders came to an end, in which, by the way, Sheila, who was as active as a mountain colt, had particularly distinguished herself, the recall bugle was sounded. A late afternoon tea was served and a descent made to the lower level, where the drags, carriages, buggies, and dog-carts stood with horses harnessed up ready to start. Among these last mentioned vehicles was one, a dog-cart, which was originally intended to accommodate more than one pair. The driver regretted his inability to take up a third person for want of room. It subsequently came out that, being a youth of foresight, he had removed the back seat before leaving Hobart, holding the ancient averment, "Two's company, three's none," still to be in force and acceptation. However, after the inevitable amount of bustle and occasional contention of ostlers, all the teams were duly mustered and loaded up in the same order as before. There were, of course, certain reconstructions, among which it was noted that Mrs. Blount had relinquished her seat next to Miss Maguire in favour of the flag lieutenant of the Orlando, alleging preference for the higher seat behind, as by this removal she commanded a more extensive view of the glorious landscape spread out by sea and shore, below and around. Sheila and Lieutenant Harcourt did not appear to be so deeply interested in scenery, at least on this occasion, as they kept their heads down mostly and spoke, though uninterruptedly, in rather a low tone during the homeward drive. On one occasion, however, they looked up suddenly as a fresh young voice commenced the opening verse of a well-known song, and before the magical couplet of "The ship is trim and ready, and the jolly days are done" was well over, the whole of the occupants of the drag, as well as those of the one immediately behind, joined in with tremendous enthusiasm, until, when the comprehensive statement that "they all loved Jack" was reached, the very seagulls on the beach were startled and flapped away with faint cries of remonstrance. Then for one moment the flag lieutenant and Sheila looked into one another's eyes, and read there something not wholly subversive of the sentiment. The moon had risen, illuminating the broad estuary over which, in shimmering gleams, lustrous lines of fairy pathway stretched to the silvery mist of the horizon. Star-fretted patches of lambent flame traversed the wavelets, which ever and anon raised a glittering spray upward, while from time to time the low but distinct rhythmic roll of the surges fell on the ear. Higher and higher rose the moon in the dark blue cloudless sky. The surroundings were distinctly favourable to those avowals which the moon has, from time immemorial, had under her immediate favour and protection. If some of the merry maidens of the day's festa listened to vows more ardent than are born of the prosaic duties of everyday life, what wonder? Next morning there was great excitement at the clubs and among all the inner circles of Hobart society. 2 engagements were given out, one being that of Lieutenant Vernon Harcourt of the Orlando to Miss Sheila Maguire of Tumut Park, New South Wales, and the other of Mr. Charles Herbert and a young lady to whom he had long been attached, though circumstances had hitherto delayed his declaration. Suspicions had been aroused as to Mr. Jack Clark and another fair maid, but nothing was as yet known for a fact. Of course, little was done on the day following this stupendous entertainment. Everybody was too tired, or declared themselves to be so. The members of the Polo Club got up a scratch match, however, just to shake off the effects of a late sitting at whist. A few ladies rode out to this affair, the ground being situated picturesquely on the bank of the broad Derwent. Among these Dianas was Sheila, riding a handsome thoroughbred and escorted by Mr. Bruce, also exceptionally well mounted. Mr. Harcourt was observed to join them from time to time when his quarter was up at polo. He was the show player of the fleet, always in a foremost position at the gymkhana. In this particular match Sheila was observed to take great interest, turning pale indeed on one occasion when he was knocked off his horse in a violent passage at arms. His opponent was adjudged to have been in the wrong, and well scolded by the captain of his side. The game went on, and Sheila recovered her roses, her spirits also, sufficiently to join in the cheering when Lieutenant Harcourt's side won the match by a goal and 2 behinds. Both of the engagements met with general approbation. The Tasmanian young lady and her lover belonged to, so to speak, county families, known from childhood to all the squirearchy of the island, always general favourites. So everybody congratulated sincerely and wished them luck. The oversea couple were, of course, strangers, and under other circumstances local jealousy might have been aroused by a girl from another colony carrying off a handsome naval officer, always a prize in colonial cities. But Sheila's simple, kindly, unaffected manner had commended her to even the severest critics of her own sex, the more sensible members excusing his invidious preference among so many good-looking, well-turned-out damsels, something after this fashion: "You see, he's only a lieutenant. It may be years before he gets a ship. He couldn't afford to marry yet without money. They say she has tons of it, and she is certainly very good-looking and nice in her manner. So Mr. Harcourt hasn't done himself so badly." One person was slightly dissatisfied. That was his captain. "He is my sailing master, and a very good one, too," he said in an ill-used tone of voice. "He'll always be thinking of her now, and counting the days till he can leave the service. Suppose the ship runs on a rock, I get my promotion stopped, and all because of this confounded girl. Different point of view." As for Sheila and her lieutenant, they were perfectly, genuinely, unmistakably happy. They were both young, she just 20, he not quite arrived at 30. He was a rising man in his profession, and Sheila's money, which was very properly to be settled upon herself, would allow them to live most comfortably while he was on shore, besides aiding, as money always does, directly or indirectly, in his promotion. So the immediate prospect was bright. Sheila declared that she had always loved sailors since that eventful ball where she had joined in the dance on equal terms with the nobility of Britain. What a fortunate girl she was to have such friends, and how much more fortunate she had become since. This memorable picnic, often referred to in after years, was considered to be virtually, if not officially, declared the closing event of the season. The fleet was to sail in a week or 10 days for the islands, a comprehensive term for a general look round the lands and seas of the South Pacific, in the interest of British subjects. They would be back in Sydney in 3 or 4 months, at the end of which time, a terrifically long and wearisome period, Sheila thought, she and her sailor were to be married. The Admiral's ship and officers would then return to England after a month's stay in Hobart and Sydney, the time of his commission having expired, and another Admiral with another flag lieutenant would replace them. Sheila would also go to England, but not in the Orlando, modern regulations having put a stop to that pleasing privilege. But she could take passage in a P&O steamer, leaving about the same time, and be in England ready to receive him in a pretty house of their own, their very own, where they would be as happy as princes, indeed happier than some. After the departure of the fleet, a certain calmness, not exactly a dullness, but bordering on something of that nature, began to settle upon the Isle of Rest and Recreation. The Queenslanders, the New South Wales division, the Victorians, South Australians, and New Zealanders were taking their passages. Edward Bruce began to get more and more fidgety. He was certain that he was wanted at the station. Really, if his wife and Imogen could not make up their minds to leave, he must go home and leave them to follow. Matters were in this unsettled state when suddenly in the cable column appeared the startling announcement: "The Earl of Fontenay died suddenly yesterday at Lutterworth, soon after hearing the news of his eldest son's death at Malta from an accident at polo. The title and estates devolve upon the younger son, the Honourable Robert Valentine Blount, at present in Australia." This news, it may be well imagined, was received with mingled feelings by the people most nearly concerned. The Earl had been in failing health for years past, but as a confirmed invalid had not aroused apprehension of a sudden termination to his succession of ailments. Blount and his father had been on excellent terms. Their only serious disagreement had been on the subject of the younger son's unreasonable wandering, as the old man termed it, to far countries and among strange people. He had not gone the length of prohibition, however, and his last letter had assured the errant cadet of his father's satisfaction at his marriage, and of his anxiety to welcome the bride to the home of their race. Now all this was over. Blount would never behold the kind face lighting up with the joy of recognition, or have the pride of presenting Imogen in all her grace and beauty to the head of his ancient house. His brother Falkland, too, who used to laugh at his pilgrimages, as he called them, and asked to be shown his staff and scrip, with the latest news of the unholy land, as he persisted in naming Australia. What good chums they were, and had always been. His brother had never married, in that respect only withstanding his father's admonitions, but promising an early compliance. Now, of course, in default of a baby heir, Blount was Lord Fontenaye, the inheritor of one of the oldest historic titles and estates of the realm, a position to which he had never dreamed of succeeding, the thought of which, if it had ever crossed his mind, was dismissed as equivalent in probability to the proverbial Château en Espagne. Perhaps his most powerful consolation, independently of the change in becoming an English nobleman with historic titles and a seat in the House of Lords, was the contemplation of Imogen as Lady Fontenaye. To her the feeling at first was painful rather than otherwise. She sympathized too deeply in all her husband's mental conditions not to share his grief for the sudden loss of a father and brother to whom he had been warmly attached. He would never be able to tell that father now how deeply he regretted the careless disregard of his feelings and opinions, nor could he share with his brother, in the old home, those sports to which both had been so attached since boyhood's day. The pride of proving that in a far land and among men of his own blood he had been able to carve out a fortune for himself, and to acquire an income far from inconsiderable even in that land of great fortunes, even this satisfaction was now denied him. Imogen, too, dreading always an inevitable separation from her sister, felt now that their absences must necessarily be greater, more lengthened, until at last a correspondence by letter at intervals would be all that was left to them of the happy old days in which they had so delighted. Why could not fate indeed have left them where they were, provided with a good Australian fortune which they could have spent and enjoyed among their own people, where Valentine would have in time become an Australian country gentleman, bought a place on the Upper Sturt, and lived like a king, going of course to Hobart in the summer, and running down to Melbourne now and then. Why indeed should they have this greatness thrust upon them? So when Imogen was called upon by various friends ostensibly to inquire, but really to see how she took it, and whether she showed any foreshadowing of the dignities and calmness of exalted rank, they were surprised to see from red eyes and other signs that the young woman upon whom all these choice gifts had been showered had evidently been having what is known in feminine circles as a good cry, and was far from being uplifted by the rank and fame to which she had been promoted. This state of manners was considered to be so unwise, unnatural, and in a sense ungrateful to the giver of all good gifts, that they set themselves to rate her for the improper state of depression into which she had allowed herself to fall. She was enjoined to think of her duty to society, her rank, her position among the aristocracy of the proudest nobility in the world. Of course it was natural for her husband to be grieved at the death of his father and his brother, but time would soften that sorrow, and as she had never seen them, it would not be expected of her to go into deep mourning, or to wear it very long. In the face of these and other practical considerations, Imogen felt that there would be a flavour of affectation in the appearance of settled grief, and allowed her friends to think that they had succeeded in clearing away shadows. But she confided to Mrs. Bruce, in the confidence of the retiring hour, that Val and she would always look back to their quiet days at Marondah and their holiday lotus-eating season in Hobart as part of the real luxuries and enjoyments of their past life. However, you will have to come and see me at Fontenaye. How strangely it sounds, with Edward and the dear children, and we must get Mr. Tregonwell to make something happen to the Tasmanian Comstock, so that we will come out like a shot. But oh, my dear old Australia, how I shall grieve at parting with you forever." Then the sisters kissed and wept in each other's arms, and were comforted. So women are soothed in time of trial. On the next morning Imogen appeared at breakfast with an unruffled countenance, talking soberly to her husband and brother-in-law about the wonderful change in their future lives, and their departure by the next mail steamer. This, of course, was imperative. The situation became urgent. Mr. Bruce agreed to remain until the P&O Rome RMS came for her load of so many thousand cases of Tasmanian apples, and with incidental passengers steamed away for Albany, Colombo, Aden, Cairo, and the East, that gorgeous shadowy name of wonder and romance. Then would the Australian family return to their quiet home by the rippling, winding waters of the Sturt, and the English division return to become an integral part of the rank and fashion, the might, majesty, and dominion of the world-wide empire which has stood so many assaults, and which still unfurls to every wind of heaven the flag that's braved 1,000 years, the battle, and the breeze. It came to pass during one of the necessary conversations relative to the voyage, that Lord Fontenaye said to her ladyship, "Does anything occur to you relative to Sheila Maguire, my dear Imogen?" "Indeed, I have been thinking about her a great deal lately," said the youthful Countess. "She can't be married until Lieutenant Harcourt and the fleet return from the islands. Till then she will have to stay in Hobart. Won't that be a little awkward for her? She has no friends, that is to say, intimate friends over here, though of course we could get her efficient chaperonage, eh?" "I know what you are thinking of, Val. It would be the very thing, and oh, how kind of you!" "What am I thinking of, and why am I so kind? Have I married a thought reader, my dear Imogen?" "Why, of course you are intending to ask her to go home with us, and to be married from Fontenaye. It is a splendid idea. It would be unspeakably nice for her, and she would be such a help and comfort to me on our travels." "The very thing. Do you think she will like the idea?" "Like it? She will be charmed. He will come to England with the men of the Orlando who are to be replaced, and they can be married as soon as she can get her trousseau together. We shall go to England much about the same time as the Admiral, so that Mr. Harcourt will be on full pay the whole time. I dare say it will be 2 or 3 months before he gets another ship. Poor dear Sheila, she never dreamed of being married from a castle any more than I did of living in one after I was married." "Or that I should give her away, as I suppose I shall have to do," rejoined her husband. "Giving agreeable girls away," he hummed. "I shall feel like the Lord Chancellor in Iolanthe." When this deep-laid plot was unfolded to Sheila, she entered into the spirit of it with enthusiasm, expressing the deepest gratitude, as with tears in her eyes she thanked her tried friends for their thoughtful kindness. "I was rather down about being left alone here," she confessed. "It was all very well when I belonged to your party, but being here by myself till the fleet returned, and fancying all sorts of things in Mr. Harcourt's absence, was different. The advantage is not altogether on your side, Sheila. You will be company for me when my husband is away. We're both Australians, you see, and there are many things in common between us, old bush memories and adventures, that an English friend, however nice she was, wouldn't understand. Really, I feel quite cheered up now that I know you're coming with us." "And what do I feel?" cried Sheila. "But I won't describe it." Her colour deepened, and her dark grey eyes glowed as she stood up and looked at her benefactress with passionate emotion in every line of her expressive face. "Yes, I feel that I could die for you." She clasped Imogen's hand as she spoke, and kissing it again and again, rushed from the room. "Her Irish blood came out there," said Blount. "How handsome the girl has grown, and what a figure she has! She'll rather astonish our untravelled friends in England. You're quite right, though, as to her being a comfort to you in foreign parts, and you can talk about the Upper Sturt and dear old Miranda together when you feel low-spirited." "Dear Miranda," said Imogen softly. "I wonder when we shall see the old river again, and the willows dipping their branches into its clear waters." "Oh, you mustn't let yourself run down that way. Bruce will be home next summer if bullocks keep up and the price of wool. Think how they'll enjoy coming to stay with us, and what shooting and hunting he and I can have together. Sheila can hunt too. I'll smoke a cigar in the garden, and you'd better go to bed, my dear." But little more remains to be told concerning the fortunes of Imogen and her husband, now Lord and Lady Fontenaye. They decided on a month's sojourn in Cairo, where they revelled in the mild climate and the daily marvels and miraculous sights and sounds. The enchanted Arabian Nights surroundings, the veiled women, the Arab horses, the balconies almost touching across the narrow streets. The old-world presentment of the East was inexpressibly fascinating to Imogen and Sheila, seen for the first time. They did Egypt, more or less thoroughly, as they planned not to reach England before April, Imogen declaring that the cold winds of March would lay her in an early grave. So they went up the Nile as far as Philae, filling their minds with such glories and marvels as might suffice for the mental digestion of a lifetime. They rode and explored to their heart's content royal Thebes, Egyptian treasure house of boundless wealth, that boasts her 100 gates, Luxor with its labyrinth of courts and superb colonnades, Karnak that darkens the horizon with a world of portals, pyramids, and palaces. "Perhaps we may never see these wonders again," said Imogen, "but I shall revel in their memories as long as I live. What do you say, Sheila?" "I feel as if I was just born," said the excited damsel, "and was just opening my eyes on a new world. Awakening in heaven, if it's not wrong to say so, must be something like this." "What a charming way of getting over the winter," said Imogen. "One sees so much of the world in the process, besides meeting people of mark and distinction. Val tells me we may have a fortnight in Paris for hats and dresses before arriving in dear old England sometime in April, which is a lovely month if the spring is early. And this year they say it is. 'Oh, to be in England now that April's here,'" quoted Lord Fontenaye, who now joined the party. "We shall be comfortably settled in Fontenaye, I hope, before the merry month of May, when I shall have the honour of showing you two cornstalks what a London season is like." "Oh, and shall we be able to ride in the park?" quoth Sheila, with great eagerness. "I do so long to see the wonderful English horses that one hears so much about, the four in hand and coaching clubs too. What a sight it must be! I must have a horse worth looking at, price no object, new saddle and habit too. Oh, what fun it will be! And you'll give Mrs. Blount, I mean her ladyship, a horse too, won't you?" "You're a true Australian, Sheila," said he. "I believe you all care more about horses than anything else in the world. Now that the Comstock is so encouraging in the way of dividends, I believe it will run to 150 guinea hackney or two, with a new landau, a brougham, and other suitable equipages." These rose-coloured anticipations were duly realized. A wire was sent from Paris, and the wandering heir was duly received and welcomed in the halls of his ancestors. The time-honoured feasting of tenants and fêting of the whole countryside was transacted, a comprehensive programme having been arranged by the land steward, a man of great experience and organising faculty. The younger son of the house, it was explained, had always been the more popular one, and now that he had come to his own, as the people said, their joy was unbounded. Everything was done on a most liberal scale. Correspondence came down special from the great London dailies, by whom full and particular descriptions were sent through all Britain and her colonies, as well as to the ends of the earth generally. The beauty and gracious demeanour of Lady Fontenaye and her friend Miss Sheila Maguire, an Australian heiress of fabulous wealth, were descanted upon and set forth in glowing colours. Archives were ransacked for the ancestors of all the Marmions, from the days of Flodden and those earlier times when Robert de Marmion, Lord of Fontenaye in Normandy, followed the Conqueror to England, and after Hastings obtained a grant of the castle and town of Tamworth, and also the manor of Scrivel Bay in Lincolnshire. Harry Blount, Marmion's attendant squire, was, according to the custom of the day, a cadet of the house, and being knighted with Fitz-Eustace for gallantry at Flodden, attained to wealth and distinction, eventually through marriage with one of the co-heiresses of the house of Marmion, extinct in default of male heirs, became possessed of the title and estates. Hence Robert Valentine Blount, the present Lord Fontenaye, has duly succeeded to the ancient tower and town amid appropriate festivities and rejoicings. We are not aware that his lordship presented a gold chain of 12 mark weight to the pursuivants, or that the gentlemen of the press, but that the hospitality was thoughtful, delicate, and unbounded in liberality, no one honoured by its exercise will deny; while the beauty and gracious demeanour of the lady of the castle, so efficiently supported in her duties by her friend, the handsome Australian heiress, Miss Maguire of Tumut Park, lent additional lustre to the entertainment. There for a while we may leave them in the enjoyment of youth, health, and historic rank. If such gifts do not confer unclouded happiness, it must be admitted that but few of the elements of which it is supposed to be compounded were wanting. Some delay in Sheila's marriage, however, took place. The Orlando, after having been ordered to China to the dismay of the captain and at least 2 of the senior officers, who had private reasons for not desiring to explore the flowery land, either in peace or war, was as suddenly recalled and the cruiser Candace ordered to take her place. The Orlando was paid off and the Royal Alfred, with a new crew and officers, put into commission and dispatched to the Australian station at short notice. A telegram from Fontenay caused Commander Harcourt, R.N., to betake himself to that vicinity at once. He had been promoted to the rank of commander for a dashing exploit in bringing off a boat's crew at Guadalcanar, in the teeth of tremendous odds and a shower of poisoned arrows. There was no need for delay now. Sheila had her trousseau ready weeks before, and the the captain, did not require much time to make his preparations. So there was another entertainment at Fontenay of comparative splendour and more true kindness and genuine friendship. All the neighbouring gentry were bidden to the feast, as well as the brother officers of the bridegroom. Lord Fontenay gave away the bride and made a feeling speech at the breakfast. When Commander Harcourt, R.N., and his lovely bride, for Sheila, in a confection from Paris, looked beautiful exceedingly, walked down the aisle of the old Abbey church, a girl of the period said it put her in mind of Lord Marmion and Lady Clare, only that Marmion was a soldier and not a sailor, and now that she remembered, he turned out badly, didn't marry Clare after all, was killed indeed at Flodden, and ought to have married poor Clare, who did not do so badly, nor Lord Wilton either, after recovering his lands, his lady love, and his position in society. After this momentous function, Lord Fontenay one fine morning looked up from the Times, which, after the fashion of secure husbands, he read during breakfast, with a sudden exclamation that caused Imogen to inquire what it was about. "The death of Mrs. Delamere, poor thing. That will make a difference." "Difference to whom?" inquired Imogen. "Oh, I see. Now those two can get married. Have you heard from them since they went to West Australia?" "Yes, I know you showed me her letter." "I heard of them later on from a man I knew that the Colonel had bought into the Golden Hoof, or some such name, and was likely to make a big rise out of it, as he expressed it. What a turn of the wheel it would be, wouldn't it? He was dry blowing after they got to West Australia." "What in the world's that?" "A primitive way of extracting gold from auriferous earth, partly by sifting it and then by blowing away the lighter dust particles when the gold, if there is any, remains behind. Then their tent caught fire one day when she was away for an hour marketing. Fancy Adeline buying soap and candles at a digging. And everything they had in the world was burned except what they stood up in, as my informant phrased it. But you will send them something, poor things. How I pity them. Oh, how stupid I am." "You did. I know you." "Yes, and she sent it back. A decent cheque, too." "Quite right. They couldn't take it from you. You, of all men. What did you do then?" "I worked it, as Tumbarumba Dick would say. He was one of the partners in the Lady Julia claim. I sent Dick the cheque, told him to get the diggers round about to form a relief committee, and to let them subscribe their share, then spread mine out in small amounts among the genuine ones. They couldn't refuse the honest miners and their wives' assistance. No people are so generous in cases of accident or distress. Thus my money got there just the same, and helped to give the forlorn ones a fresh start. Quite another romance. I suppose you have a slight tendresse in that direction still?" "Not more than a man always has for a woman he has once loved, however badly she treated him. And that is a very mild, strictly rational sentiment. But you ought to have." "Why, I should like to know?" "Because, of course, when she broke my heart and sent me out into the world drifting purposeless, I fell across one Imogen Carrisforth, who towed the derelict into port, and made prize of him, indeed, for ever and ever. Well, I suppose she did shape our destiny, as you say, without the least intending it, and now I suspect she'll shape the Colonel's for good and all. They will be remarried quietly, live in the south of France, and the gay world will hear no more of them." Fontenay was always reasonably gay, and truly hospitable to the Australian division notably. Not unduly splendid, but comfortable and reasonably fine on occasion, the nearest pack of hounds always met there on the first day of the season, when sometimes Lady Fontenay, sometimes Mrs. Vernon Harcourt appeared, superbly mounted and among the front rankers, after the throw-off. Sheila was a frequent guest in her husband's necessary absences at sea. Imogen was a little slow to accustom herself to be addressed and referred to as your ladyship, and her ladyship, at every turn, but took to it by degrees. Now what became of Kate Lawless and her brother Dick, asks an eager youthful patron of this veracious romance, not by any means wholly untrue, dear reader, though a little mixed up. And the roan pony mare Wallaby that carried Kate 90 miles in a day to warn the police about Trevenna, screams a still younger student. You mustn't leave her out. As might be expected, my dear boys, they came to a sad end. Dick and his sister disappeared after the fight at the ghost camp. They were rumored to have been seen on the Georgina River in the Gulf country. There were warrants out for both, yet they had not been arrested. But one day word came to the police station at Monaro that near a grave, at a deserted hut between the Omeo and the Running Creek, something was wrong. The sergeant, taking one trooper who drove a light wagonette, rode to the spot. "This is where Mrs. Trevenna's child was buried, the little chap that was drowned," said the trooper, "under that swamp oak. I was stationed here then and went over. She was wild, poor thing. I wonder if that's her lying across the grave." It was even so. A haggard woman, poorly dressed, showing signs of privation and far travel, lay face downward on the little mound. "Lift her up, Jackson," said the sergeant. "Poor thing, I'd hardly have known her. She came here to shoot herself. Look about for the revolver. Just on the temple, what a small hole it made. Shot the mare, too. Best thing for both of 'em, I expect. So that's the end of Kate Lawless. Who'd have thought it when that flash crowd was at Ballarat? Handsome girl she was then, full of life and spirits too." "She never did no good after the boy was drowned," said the trooper. "No, nor before either. But it wasn't all her fault. Let's lift her into the trap, she don't weigh much. There'll be the inquest, and she'll have Christian burial. They can't prevent that in this country. And she suffered enough to make a dozen women shoot themselves, or men either." So the dead woman came into the little township, and after the coroner's jury had brought in their verdict that the deceased had died by her own hand, but that there was no evidence to show her state of mind at the time, poor Kate Trevenna, or Lawless, was buried among more or less respectable people. There was a slight difference of opinion as to the identification of the woman's corpse, but none whatever as to that of the mare among the horse-loving bystanders around the grave, which was several times visited during the following days. "That's old Wallaby safe enough," deposed one grizzled stock rider. "Reg'lar mountain mare, skip over them rocks like a billy goat, couldn't throw her down no ways. Ain't she dog poor, too? Kate and she's had hard times lately. What say, boys, s'pose we bury her? The ground's middlin' soft, and if she don't ought to be buried decent, no one does." The idea caught on, and a pick and spade contingent driving out next day, a grave was dug and a stone put up on which was roughly chiseled, "Wallaby. Died. The end." End of chapter 12. Recording by Philip Gould. End of The Ghost Camp by Rolf BOLDREWOOD.